Hello and welcome to the 10th episode of Orthodoxy, Autocracy and Nationality, a Turkish Caesar. Today we are going to be discussing the fall of Constantinople, Mehmed II, the legacy of Byzantium carrying over into the Ottoman Empire, the Conquest of the Balkans by Mehmed and his son Bayezid, and we'll be finishing off the stream by talking about Selim the Grim and his conquest of Syria, the Hejaz, and Egypt. Wonderful to be joined this week by Semiagog. Hello, sir.
Hello, gentlemen. Very happy to be here.
And by my regular co-host, Marcus Furious Pertinax.
Hello, everybody. Greetings.
Yes, very unfortunately, we don't have Columba here today. Sadly, he's ill, so hopefully he'll be well enough to do our stream next week where we talk about Suleiman the Magnificent. But for now, very lucky to be joined by these two very erudite fellows. So the first thing I really want to cover, if that's okay with you, you guys, is the prelude to the fall, so to speak. So what was the predicament of the Byzantine Empire in the decade or so leading up to the conquest? Is there anything either of you want to start off with?
I'll go. You can see from the map here that, and we touched on this with the last of our streams, that sort of was leading. It was a sort of the intro, the starter into this end epoch of the empire. When the castle fell at Sestos between the Dardanelles in the late 1300s. You can tell that within a short number of a couple of decades, as a matter of fact, a relatively short number of years, once the Ottomans cross into Europe and they capture Adrianople, which would then become their European capital of Edirne, the Ottomans extend their power most massively into the Balkans, what the Turks would later call Rumelia, which actually originally, if you're speaking from an etymological perspective, was their name for Anatolia. Earlier in the history, but nonetheless, the Turks made considerable headway into the Balkans, and you can see from this map they've more or less reached the Danube. They have conquered all of northern Greece, save for the yellow there looks like Genoa. So safe from a couple of Genoese enclaves on the North Aegean. Thessalonica's fallen, Thessaly's fallen. Basically, mainland Greece up to Attica has fallen. So has Epirus, and Constantinople. The Byzantines, the East Roman Empire, is essentially constricted to the peninsula that Constantinople sits on, and some coastal cities leading up to, you can see Burgas and Mesembria up in the north, and then their holdings in the Peloponnesus, which comprises of the Morea around Mistras and Nupfilio, Andravia and Corinth, with Athens essentially as sort of a Latin tributary to the Byzantine Empire. So the situation, as is quite evident on this map here, is very dire for them.
Well, I think one little point to draw, of course, is that this has been the situation for the Eastern Roman Empire, the domains of the Paleologos dynasty, since around the middle of the 14th century. Once you have the Ottomans crossing over and establishing their new capital in Rumelia in Edirne, they, of course, then defeat the remnants of the Serbian Empire. And the Serbian Empire, of course, had ruled over Thessaly, it had ruled over Epirus, it had ruled over Macedonia. So even then, we're talking, around sort of 1350, the Byzantine Empire had ceased to be a continuous state and was just holding on to these possessions. And this is where we have the breakup of the Despotate of Morea in 1349. And I think, we've been talking a lot in our streams on Orthodoxy, Autocracy and Nationality about Byzantine exceptionalism with regards to its various institutions, starting off with the provincial system, going through the Diocletianic reforms, going into the themata, etc. And of course, what I find remarkable about this last century of Byzantine rule is how you can say they've imitated Western European customs. So one form of a government which had the Byzantines had avoided up until now was imitating the European system of appanage, granting possessions to the to the junior sons essentially. And this is what happens to the Paleologos dynasty in its last century. The empire gets parceled off piecemeal to all the various sons of the Byzantine emperor, who of course is resident in Constantinople. And due to the discontinuous nature of the Byzantine Empire, there are actually two capitals really of the Byzantine Empire at this point. One, of course, is Constantinople, the eternal Roman capital. The other, of course, is Mystras in the south near the old city of Sparta, which periodically during this time, during what was called the Paleologos Restoration, was known as New Sparta. But just, getting into the period, before the fall, the last ruler to hold all these possessions was Manuel II. And from 1395 until 1425, he had given up all of these possessions to his 6 sons. So, his eldest son, of course, is John VIII, shown here on the left. He would give up, his possessions to Andronicus and Theodore. Of course, Thessalonica would remain part of the Byzantine Empire all the way up until, if I remember correctly, 1422. When it was given to the Venetians to try and stave off, again, and fall into the forces of Murad. And this is also something to note, is that in addition to being, physically divided and, in this incredibly precarious position for so long, under Manuel II, the Byzantine Empire are paying regular tribute to the Ottomans, essentially. So they are the Emperor of Eastern Rome, the last sort of remnant of Romanitas in the Eastern sense, is paying tribute to a Turkish sultan to stave off attack essentially every year. And this, of course, essentially you can say the predicament of the Byzantine Empire is always in a constant state of flux, dependent on the goodwill of the then sultan, essentially. It's
also worth mentioning at this point, depending on the emperor and depending on the sultan, you sort of have this condition where the Byzantine, the East Romans are sort of pseudo vassals. In one instance, the reason I just mentioned that is because you mentioned Manuel, which I believe was the emperor at the time. The East Romans had one holding left on the Anatolian coast, which is a city called Philadelphia, and Manuel was actually forced to send and lead troops of the sultans amongst the sultan's army to basically capture a city off himself to give to the sultan, as an example.
And there had been quite a lot of marriage going on for some time since the days of the Sultanate of Rum, parceling off children to be married to a Muslim figure, attempting to form bonds and relationships in that fashion. But I have a question as regards the potential of receptivity on the part of Christian populations to Ottoman conquest that will probably shed some light on the dynamics here. And I wanted to put it in front of you gentlemen, since you know more about it. But my understanding is that there was considerable receptivity on the part of Orthodox Christians to Ottoman conquest, in the sense that under Ottoman suzerainty, they had considerable freedom to practice their religion. They'd obviously be subject to different tax regimes. They would not be as free in all respects. There's the issue of devshirme and recruitment of populations for service in the Janissary Corps. But when you compare it to this situation they faced under the Latins, for some of them, at some times, as I understand it, and I put it in front of you guys to tell me if I'm correctly grasping this part of history, they would actually enjoy a better situation and be able to practice their faith more easily than they would under, the Venetians and the rest, who had pushed in with the Latin Church into a number of the former Byzantine domains. Would you say that that's accurate? Do either of you know anything about this?
Absolutely, Semigog. I think this is going to be one of the main focuses, for the stream in general, especially when we get to the post-conquest situation. We get to Gennadios II. Regarding this period in particular, as you can see on this map, the Francocratia, i.e. the parts of Greece which were still held by Catholic princes, was still very much alive. So Crete was controlled by the Venetians. The Venetians controlled various islands such as Euboea. The Genoese controlled the Cyclades and Lesbos. You had the Despotate of Epirus, which was founded originally as a Byzantine rump state under the Komnenoi Ducos family, and now it had essentially given over to a Italian family, the Tocchi. And of course, during this time, there is the fraught question about the union of the church, the Byzantine Church with Rome, and one of the conflicts we see, from 1420 onwards until 1453, is the Byzantine Emperor trying, whether it be John VIII or whether it be Constantine the 11th, trying to balance the forces of, appealing to Rome to form, to get up extra troops, to send and buttress the, incredibly small number of defenders in Constantinople, versus, drawing the ire of his subjects for giving away too much religious authority to Rome. And this is very much the legacy of the 1204 sack of Constantinople. There is an immense bitterness between the Greeks and the Latins, so to speak. And I think one of the remarkable points about this history we're going over now is something that's almost seldom ever been mentioned, which is that in the south, in the Peloponnese, the Palaiologos dynasty actually undergo quite a remarkable recovery at the expense of the Francocratia, so much so that, as Marcus alluded to earlier, Attica and the Duchy of Athens, which was a remnant of the Francocratia, one of these Catholic states which was set up in the aftermath of the sack, actually becomes a tributary to the Byzantine Emperor again. And so I really want to sort of get into this, which is bringing in the personality of Constantine the 11th. So Constantine begins his career in about 1420. He's not expected to inherit. He has three elder brothers, and he is essentially placed in charge of Morea briefly to deal with an invasion from the Latins in Epirus, and he succeeds in doing so. However, his position is fraught essentially because of the system of appanage. He has to deal with all of his other brothers claiming, control over these various domains. What happens after 1425 is that Manuel II dies, and John VIII, the oldest of the brothers, becomes the Byzantine Emperor. And invariably, John VIII relies on his younger, competent brother, Constantine the 11th, to act as regent whenever he goes off to Europe to try and, again, desperately search for allies. And again, the result of one of these search for allies is the Council of Florence, is the union of the churches, which, of course, leads to a huge amount of division and bitterness back home. But when he's not regent over Constantinople, he's in the Peloponnese, consolidating his position at the expense of the, various princes of the Francocratia. Just getting into this new situation regarding the specifics of the conflict. So in 1439, you have the union of the churches of the Council of Florence, where basically the emperor accepts the supremacy of the Pope, and basically the Eastern Church under the ecumenical patriarch, who at this point was Gregory III, entered into communion with the Catholic Church in the West. And this prompted a massive backlash in the form of an organization known as the Synaxis. One of the most prominent members would eventually be George Scholarios. He starts off as a member of the pro-Union faction and then becomes one of its leading opponents after about 1447. But this is also something which is exploited within the Byzantine royal family as well, because the effect of having these 6 brothers vying for control over the empire, and the fact that primogeniture is never established in Roman tradition as a sure principle of succession, means that princes such as Demetrios in particular are vying for political power by exploiting the divisions between the anti-Union and Union factions, and also at the same time appealing to the Ottomans as the pro-Ottoman candidate and the anti-Catholic faction. So it is an incredibly fraught and divided situation. Not only is Byzantium in a terrible geographical and military predicament, but there is a dynastic predicament and there is a religious component as well, all factoring into this. That and the fact that, in terms of the economy, Morea is relatively prosperous during this time, and undergoes, a long sort of period of stable reign under the rule of Constantine the 11th. Once he's able to rein in his unruly brothers, whether that would be Theodore, whether that be Thomas, whether that be Demetrios. And he's able essentially to govern these provinces well, but nevertheless What the Byzantines are relying on at this point is essentially salvation. They want salvation from the West because, as you can see, the Byzantines are not in any situation politically to drive out the Ottomans on their own. They need deliverance from the West, and this is why we're in this constant conflict between, the Union faction over the church and the anti-Union faction over the church. Essentially, how much of your sovereignty are you prepared to give away in order to preserve your civilization, essentially? The result of this being, of course, the disastrous defeat at Varna, which we discussed in the end of our last stream. And of course, one of the most active proponents of the Union, Cardinal Cesarini, died along with King Vladislav at Varna. And in my mind, that was the last real effective crusade before the fall of Constantinople. All of the petitions for help coming from the papacy, coming from the West after that, were on a much smaller scale. So, for example, when Constantine XI becomes king, Nicholas V sends a detachment of 200 Neapolitan archers. But in terms of help, there are a couple of Venetian galleys, there are a couple of Genoese galleys, but nothing on the scale that we've seen with 1444.
But with that particular crusade that ended so disastrously at Varna, as I recall, the Pope essentially provided his blessing and sent a cardinal along, but didn't send any men. And as I recall, also Brankovic in Serbia sat it out, trying to stick with Murad II's peace treaty. So the Western powers had been doing very, very little at all to help in this situation. And at the same time, although you gentlemen are both very, very well aware of it, for our listeners who might imagine that the Ottoman Empire was an empire of Turks, you have to remember that the House of Osman was small, and the Turkish proportion, depending on what region you were in, could be quite small indeed. So for a lot of the Eastern, the members of the Eastern churches, it was a question of one empire over another, and it was very much a mixed imperial arrangement with its different ethnic groups within it. So, my big question is, to what extent were, for example, the Venetians tolerant of the religious practices of the Eastern Church? Beyond the idea of the agreements that had been made at a higher level, is it possible to say whether or not members of the Eastern Church, for example, in a Venetian possession, would be as free to practice their religion as members of the Western Church? What sort of pressure were they under? How was their own outlook shaped by these circumstances? Did they have reason to be angry, not just about the unification seemingly occurring further up the food chain, but what about their day-to-day life under the Venetians or in a Genoese colony?
I think Venice is an interesting case because they were regularly under attack from the Pope for not being zealous enough in terms of converting their local populations. So the Venetians would periodically rule over large parts of Greece, not just throughout this period, but we're talking from the 13th century all the way up until the 18th century, when in fact the Venetian Republic would finally collapse. In fact, I think it was in the aftermath of the Great Turkish War, the Venetians would acquire the Morea again. And compared to other Catholic powers, so for example, contemporary powers in the West, such as the Castilians and the Aragonese, the Venetians were very lenient towards their Greek Orthodox subjects. But again, because the Venetians were principally a maritime power, nevertheless, that resentment over the sack still very much existed at that point. And due to the fractured nature of the Francocratia, the attacks on the local Orthodox populations varied from possession to possession. And there was this genuine fear from the Eastern Orthodox subjects that, again, a potential Catholic rule could be worse than a potential Eastern Orthodox rule. That was definitely the thinking of Gennadius II when he confirmed Mehmed II in his position. So yes, there is a lot of truth in what you're saying. And I think the question ultimately boils down to the unification of Christendom as a whole versus, you can almost say, a particularism within Christianity, Eastern Greek Christendom against what was then, the largest church in the world, the Catholic Church. In terms of your comment about the troops that the Pope sent, I think it's also important to note, going back to my previous stream last week talking about the Italian wars, the Pope at the time was Eugene IV. We're not getting into the grand, late Renaissance popes, beginning with Nicholas V, and he was not in a position to send really any troops at all. It's actually remarkable that Nicholas V was able to send 200 troops, because the papacy at that time was destitute, bankrupt, and barely controlled anything beyond the city of Rome itself. Whereas the Hungarians and the Poles delivered tens of thousands of men to attack at Varna, and of course their king, both the King of Hungary and the King of Poland, Vladislav, died at that battle. So I think, again, in terms of major powers, a lot of resources were put against the Ottoman Empire, but to no avail. I think when we talk about the after effects, when we talk about the situation after 1453, what is remarkable is that we have these incredible personalities in the form of Skanderbeg, who also happened to be a Catholic, Vladislav Draculisti, who of course Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, Stefan the Great and the Holy, and of course John Hunyadi. You have all of these major personalities commanding very effective armies against the Ottomans, being able to defeat Mehmed II in person again and again and again. And yet the Ottomans are always able to bounce back, raise new troops, and defeat them, which is quite incredible. But I think, relaying this back to the situation in Byzantium as a whole, John VIII dies in 1448, and essentially you're in a fraught situation where Demetrios, one of the most unscrupulous of the brothers, goes over to the Ottoman camp basically, and says, you can support me, and I'll also support Gennadius Scalaris against the Union faction. And it's actually the Queen Regent Helene Dragos, the mother of John VIII, who organizes the smooth transition of power to the despot of Morea, Constantine XI, thus preventing a civil war and a potential usurpation by Demetrios. And from this position, Constantine organizes, he goes around Europe like his brother had done, trying to organize marriage pacts with Trebizond, with Georgia, with Serbia, with Aragon. And rather than, killing his rebellious brother Demetrios, Demetrios goes to Mystras, and he is placed essentially as, the new despot, the new viceroy for the emperor who's taken over control of Constantinople. And in terms of relaying this back to the situation regarding the Ottomans and the Byzantine Empire, as I said, a lot of this relies on the personal disposition of the emperor. Invariably, you had many attempts, half-hearted attempts, to take the city from the Ottoman side. In one case, when it comes to Demetrios, it's to place a Ottoman-friendly emperor on the throne. In others, it seems like a more earnest attempt to take the city, and this really begins with Murad II, Bayezid Yildirim, and of course, then you have the disaster at Ankara in 1402, and the effect of that is, as I think we would all agree, it delays the inevitable. It delays the conquest of the city. And what is quite remarkable is that you have Murad II, who unites the empire, after inheriting from his father Mehmed, and is able to defeat the forces, the Crusader forces at Varna, and he, temporarily gave up power to his son Mehmed II in 1444, only to take it back in 1446. One of the remarkable things about him is that he holds to the truce. He accepts this tributary relationship with then John VIII and later Constantine XI, and he doesn't attack the city. But when, and again, this is after him having started his reign, basically saying, I'm going to attack the city. He attacks Venice, he takes Thessaloniki, but he never actually takes Constantinople itself. So when Mehmed II finally comes to his majority in 1451, takes over from his father, I believe he's in his late teens at this point, nearly 20 years old. One of his, he makes a grand sort of display to the emissary of Constantine XI, that there'll be this great peaceful alliance between us. And of course, this is often the sort of diplomatic prevarication that is a prelude to an attack, as would happen with Trebizond. And all of this sort of culminates in the fact that I think Mehmed II, right from the beginning, right from 1451, was determined that he would accomplish what none of his predecessors managed, which is the conquest of Constantinople. And now, why was he so determined to conquer Constantinople? Well, one of his tutors, you'll probably get at me for the pronunciation, Semigog, do forgive me, Aksham Zazin, a Sufi saint, had discovered supposedly the grave of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, who had been one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad and a standard bearer for him, and had died at the first siege of Constantinople back in 674. And nearly 1,000 years later, you're rediscovering the tomb of a person who again originally led this attack on Constantinople during the Umayyad Caliphate all the way back then. And for Mehmed II, this is a perfect tool to sort of reinvigorate this idea of the Ottoman ruler as Ghazi, as the religious warrior. And of course, when he ultimately takes the city of Constantinople, he then builds the Eyüp Sultan Mosque to commemorate this in particular. But in terms of like a direct provocation, because of the weird situation the Byzantine Emperor and the Ottoman Sultan is in, because of this tributary relationship, because of the treaties, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II can't just attack Constantinople. He needs a pretext. And there is a very handy pretext which Constantine XI, through a major miscalculation, basically offers him. Dating back from this Ottoman interregnum, one of the princes of the House of Osman, Orhan, a descendant of Bayezid I, Bayezid Yildirim, had basically been resident in Constantinople. And to prevent him being unleashed into the Ottoman Empire and possibly cause a civil war, Mehmed II had been giving him a vast amount of tribute. And Constantine XI threatens that unless he was to massively increase the scale of that tribute, Constantine would release Orhan and basically send him to wreak havoc in the Ottoman Empire. And Mehmed II takes this as a hostile act, and he believes he's fully within his rights to break the truce, essentially. And from this point on, from 1451 until 1452, he begins constructing the Rumeli Hisar at the entrance of the Bosphorus Straits, essentially cutting off and controlling the straits, controlling naval access for the Venetians and the Genoese to possibly reach the city and support it, essentially, or any sort of future support from the West. So he's basically cutting off the city and planning for the attack, which will ultimately come in 1453. This is where you have the sorry.
I just wanted to say, if I can throw in a bit of background for it. At this point, the Ottomans had been stretched very thin. You tapped the point about the disaster of Ankara, which I'm assuming is the defeat of Lightning Bayezid by Tamerlane. Mm-hmm. And after that, there was an Ottoman interregnum, and there was considerable instability in the entire empire. And so Murad II was very, very careful. He was very systematic, very cautious and prudent, and attempted to keep his deals in terms of diplomacy because he was trying to put all the pieces back together. So at this point, within the Ottoman court itself, there was a considerable divide because everyone knew the writing was on the wall that Mehmed II was going to be coming in. But there was Murad's the second's old Grand Vizier, Halil, who was very much of the school that things should not be pressed further and stretched thin at this point where they were finally beginning to stabilize things. So Mehmed was not only pushing against the Byzantines and the rest, but within factions. But with factions within the Ottoman system itself that were against his undertakings. And a last thing to point out is that Mehmed II was the child of a slave. He was a third son. And even by Ottoman standards, his two older brothers had died under very mysterious circumstances. One, they just gloss as having died suddenly. The other one was strangled in bed. And so in attempting to recreate the picture of what was going on, this is of course just speculation, but it would seem that there were two camps within the Ottoman power bloc itself, one of which wanted to move forward, fulfill the prophecies of becoming the new Tsar or Caesar, or the Sultan, the guy in charge of all the Roman lands, and those others who were much more cautious. And it's possible to imagine, I think when the second of his older brothers, who were favored by his father, was killed, he was only like 12 years old. So even being a precocious and clever man, you have to imagine that there were forces attempting to push him forward as a candidate versus the others. So it would seem necessary to paint a picture of what was going on inside it.
Oh no, absolutely. And what I like about this line of questioning, Semigog, is that you're very much anticipating what is going to happen after 1453, what is going to happen with the drastic reforms of Mehmed II regarding his assumption of the Caesarian power in Istanbul, relating back to Halil Pasha in particular. He was a member of the Kandali family, which also just so happened to be some of the greatest landowners in Anatolia at that point. In addition to Kandali having his own agenda, and of course you can say pushing Murat II toward this prudent policy, what also needs to be noted is that Bayezid Yildirim had more or less united Anatolia. And as a result of the interregnum, many of the beyliks, the Kalamanids in particular, had basically monopolized the position that the various cities associated with the old Seljuk Sultanate of Rum were now a major contender in Anatolia. But in addition to that, Halil Pasha was also being paid quite a substantial amount by the Byzantine court to advocate for this peaceful policy at the same time. So what Mehmed II is consciously doing, in addition to invoking this religious casus belli for attacking Constantinople, is that he's wanting to break away from this noble faction within the court, and in particular that led by his Grand Vizier, his father's Grand Vizier, Kandali Halil Pasha. And of course, what does he do very quickly after taking the city, establishing his authority, and his epithet is Fethi, the Conqueror. He hasn't killed. So yes, this is an ongoing conflict, and you have to contextualize the conquest of Constantinople within the division between these two camps. One is more conservative and backed by the Turkish nobility. One, of course, is focusing on the powers of the Ottoman Sultan himself and removing these various figures such as Halil Pasha, and relying instead on a Christian Orthodox bureaucracy who are dependent solely on him for power, which is going to be, the creation of the Turkish Sultan, the Turkish Caesar. But just one point before I ask Marcus to elaborate on the conquest of Constantinople proper is the lingering problem about the union of the churches. So Eugene IV is now dead. Nicholas V is Pope. And Nicholas V sends Isidore of Kiev to try and rescue the union of the church with Constantine XI. Constantine XI's position essentially is, I will push for the union in order for as much as I can in order to gain troops from the West without alienating and causing riots in Constantinople. And one of the effects of Isidore of Kiev arriving with his 200 Neapolitan archers is a lot of the denizens of Constantinople. The population is only about 50,000 at this time. It's been reduced from 600, 500,000 to a tenth of what it should be. Essentially, the city is this incredible 5th century Theodosian wall with all of these villages essentially within all these farms. But Isidore comes in, and the Pope wants him to become the new patriarch because Gregory III has fled Constantinople, fearing his life after the anti-church faction has gone to Rome, and Isidore of Kiev is, provided by Nicholas V as a possible alternative. The anti-union faction within Constantinople sees this, and they believe, this is what our union with the church has amounted to, a meager 200 archers. And it's only the fear, because this is in 1452, it's only the fear of imminent Ottoman attack, which unites the population behind Constantine XI and temporarily allays the fears of these two rival factions. So much so that the Genoese and Venetian contingents, foreign quarters within the city, on their own volition, essentially, without the authority of their respective doges, vowed to fight within the walls of the city. And another, of course, contingent within the city. There are a large number of Ottomans within the city, thousands of them, and they fight alongside Constantine XI to defend the city. And again, you can say this is an extension almost of a small-scale civil war between the Ottoman Empire and the Christians. Of course, those Ottomans are the ones who essentially believe that, in a fundamentally different relationship between the Byzantine Emperor and the Ottoman Empire, and the fact that, again, maybe Mehmed II is not within his rights to essentially break the treaty. Many very sort of spurious reasons, of course, self-interest, etc., going into why they would basically ally against Mehmed II. And maybe, again, this informs his decision to assassinate Kandali Halil Pasha. But all of these elements playing that you have the local defenders of the city, you have the Genoese, you have the Venetians, you have papal contingents, you have a few galleys from Venice and from Genoa, no major European support. And I believe, Marcus, only about 7,000 defenders in total before the attack on the city proper. So without further ado, Marcus, would you like to elucidate on the fall of Constantinople?
Can you just go back to the previous slide just very briefly? Just because we mentioned, we've spoken about Bayezid and the defeated Ankara. Another thing just to sort of consider, just to sort of put this time frame into a little bit more perspective in this map, for instance, because we did mention Varna 1444. It is also worth mentioning too that in terms of the East Romans searching for allies around the place, and we did touch on this last stream, but this just sort of acts as a nice coupling to the siege. You've had the First Battle of Kosovo in 1389, which has neutralized Serbia, and Serbia has become a puppet of the Ottomans. Hence why, what's his name? The Serbian king ends up fighting alongside Bayezid at Ankara against
Stefan Lazarevic.
Thank you, Stefan Lazarevic. Fights alongside Bayezid at Ankara in 1402. You've also had the failed Crusader battle at Nicopolis in 1396, which was sort of like a prelude essentially to Varna. Also fought along the Danube, which was a complete failure for the Allied. It was quite a hodgepodge actually of the kingdom, the Duchy of Burgundy, Kingdom of France, Swiss contingents, Holy Roman contingents, the Venice, Genoa, Knights Hospitaller, with the Bulgarians and the Poles,
and led by Sigismund of Hungary.
So, despite all those contingents, the Crusaders were defeated. And then there's the Second Battle of Kosovo of 1448, which is another, which was led by John Hunyadi alongside Vladislav II, which was another failed attempt. So it's not as if some of these neighboring kingdoms had not assembled forces to try and relieve Constantinople. The fact
and as you can see, just one point regarding Serbia. Serbia, having been a vassal, has now also broken away from the Ottomans under the Brankovic dynasty as well, and of course support John Hunyadi's cause. So essentially, the Serbs are the last buffer before reaching Belgrade, the main fortress in the Balkans, which of course is also controlled by Hungary at this point. So yes,
correct,
there is constant low-level conflict between 1444 and 1453, and this looming expectation that the city is going to be attacked. But of course, the effect of this, the effect of all of this is when the city is actually attacked itself. Much of the resources of Europe have been exhausted at this point. Just to give that a bit of context. So yes, please go ahead, Marcus.
And so far as the Successor Kingdoms are concerned, Trebizond had been very quiet for the last 50 years. They became sort of a temporary vassal of the Timurids, and they weren't a factor. So we're sort of at the period now when we're talking about the siege itself of 1453, where the East Roman capital is, I wouldn't say entirely isolated, but it's very much so. And support is difficult, especially with the construction of the Rumeli Hisar, the Turkish fortress that's built essentially on the Propontis, and is, to my knowledge, one of the first uses of land-based sort of anti-naval artillery, which the Ottomans used to with mixed results, but with quite devastating effects when it actually works. Hence why the number of galleys that sort of sail into Constantinople from the west number in the dozens, as opposed to 100 or so. The support that arrives is rather meager, and as Apostolic did mention, and it depends on which numbers you read as well. Some say 7,000 defenders, some say 7,000 Greeks with 2,000 allied contingents. Numbers vary from 7 to 9 to sort of 8.5. They do vary. I will actually, as a side point, I'm going to tell a bit of a story about a Cretan contingent which actually makes its way to Constantinople. But before I do that, Apostolic, shall I read the refutation of Gennadios Scholarios?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so Apostolic elucidated to the schism essentially, and these forces that rallied in Constantinople sort of around the anti-unitary party essentially, which ended up being the portion of the aristocracy which supported Constantine Palaiologos, the last emperor, and Gennadios Scholarios eventually would write this is two things at once. It's an open letter essentially to the citizens of the city, and it's a refutation of the Florence Treaty. And here, I'll just read it now. These are the words of Scholarius. O piteous Romans, why have you gone astray from the righteous path? You have departed from hope in God and begun to hope in the might of the Franks. Together with the city, in which everything will soon be destroyed, have you apostatized from your piety? Be merciful to me, O Lord, for I am not guilty of this. Return, wretched citizens, and think about what you are doing. Together with the captivity which will soon befall us, why have you apostatized from the inheritance of your fathers and begun to confess dishonor? Woe to you when God's judgment shall come upon you. So you can imagine that Scholarius wasn't half measured in his words. He certainly didn't believe in the power of the Franks to save the city. Had you heard that refutation, Apostolic, or had you read it, or even Semigog for that matter?
I was not aware of it.
Yes, as someone who's quite interested in the character of Gennadios, yes, I was aware of that the refutation. And again, I think this is part of the reason why Constantine XI was criticized. I mean, there were many people on his side basically advocating that figures such as Gennadius should be arrested and the synaxis should be removed. And of course, Constantine XI, in his desperation, believed that all people, all factions should be united against the Ottoman threat. But I think, again, this is the legacy of the sack of Constantinople, that you're left in this awful predicament, basically, of trying to retain as much sovereignty and retain your independence as possible without relying on the West. And I think, given the experience of the Francocratia, and the fact the Francocratia hasn't gone, the Francocratia is still there, and the fact that Constantine XI, probably more so than any of the recent Palaiologos princes, has done more to actually promote the power of the Byzantine Empire at that expense. I think this is an ongoing issue, but I think what will be interesting when we talk about the situation after the conquest is how those words translate into a post Palaiologos political manifesto, essentially. But before we get there, the conquest itself.
So we have a picture here of the cannons, the famous Zonaro here that Mehmed is riding his horse next to. So there's a certain Hungarian by the name of Orban, who was ironically educated in one of essentially the military academy of Constantinople, or at least he went to university there. It's sort of difficult to ascertain what his actual qualification was. But nonetheless, he was a specialist in ballistics and what you would describe as rudimentary cannonry. And he actually initially offered his services to the emperor, but the emperor was simply unable to pay him. So Mehmed was quick to attain the services of Autobahn, and a number of these cannons were built. I think of the larger size, it was 3 cannons. And actually, interesting what Apostoli just said too about the Francocratia being quite real. At this point, I think up until for the last few years of the city, the Galata, which is on the opposite side of the main city of the Golden Horn, is actually still in Genoese possession, to my knowledge. So the Mehmed doesn't violate the Genoese possession of the Galata. Here we go. And you can see from this map here.
I do apologize. For some reason, I could find this iteration of the map in German and French, but not in English. I'm very sorry. So hopefully people can understand what empereur means. But yeah.
I was actually expecting just to have that left-hand map, Apostoli. So that's actually great having them both here. Thank you. Yeah, so Mehmed actually conceives, or certainly either himself or one of his generals or his engineers conceive a way to get his ships across the Golden Hornet, which is around the Galata or the Pera, depending which map you're looking at. So in order to bypass the chain, and that allows the Ottomans to attack the seawall directly. And for those who are listening to the previous episode, the seawall is the weaker portion of the main wall. It's not nearly as formidable as the main land wall. And the attacks sort of begin in earnest. And Mehmed has this knack of alternating between sort of artillery barrages and then sending his fodder against the walls. Mostly either the Christian converts or the Anatolian troops usually would send against the walls. And despite being very much outnumbered and despite being denuded of resources and having essentially no reserves, the Byzantines actually managed to put up a hell of a fight.
And may I just
show? Yeah, sorry, go.
I just want to say, if I could mention, just for those who don't know, the scale of the difference, because as you said, something like between 7 and 8.5 or 9, certainly less than 10,000 men defending the city. The estimates of the number of Ottoman troops involved go as high as 100,000. And so now I don't know if those are accurate figures, but I've certainly heard them. And the business of coming up over the walls on the greased over the hill on the greased skids to drop ships into the Golden Horn, Mehmed only had recourse to that rather late in the game because, as you said, the defenders were doing such an excellent job of defense, and they actually had a group of ships make their way up the Bosphorus to provide supplies and the rest for the defenders. And Mehmed was infuriated because he had put together, knowing that naval power was critical to this, and they hadn't had it in the past, he had put together a fleet that was something like 5 times the size of what the Christian defenders could field, and yet those ships made it in to relieve the city. At which point he got frustrated and wanted to push the ships up over the ridge and down into the Golden Horn. Of course, did it successfully, put a large number of ships in there, but the defenders just really performed magnificently, in large part supported by a Genoese guy who showed up. I believe his name was Justiniani, and he was sort of the right-hand man of the emperor in the course of all of this. But I just wanted to point out the scale. It was easily 10-1 at the high end of the estimates.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. If you consider that the Byzantines were fielding anywhere from sort of 7,000 to 9,000, the Ottomans, the low estimations probably sit around 75,000, 80,000, and some go as high as 125,000. I don't know if I quite accept that, but I could easily be talked into 10,000 either side of 100,000. I mean, considering the resources that Mehmed had at his disposal, and given the sheer number of defensive earthworks and the siege works that he committed to, and then, as you mentioned, moving the boats over the hills behind the Galata, he must have had considerable manpower at his disposal. So yeah, if you threw a number between sort of 80 and 110,000, I think you've probably got the Ottoman numbers pretty much, accurate. One thing I actually should have mentioned before the siege actually started, the Sultan did the Sultan did in fact issue an ultimatum for the emperor to surrender the city, and his refutation, Constantine's refutation of the ultimatum, actually is one of the most steadfast refutations in history, and also it's one of the very few instances where I think a king or a ruler is very cognizant of the legacy that he has. And I'll echo his quote right now. In April 1453, Mehmed gave Constantinos an opportunity to surrender the city in peace, but instead he received some of the most gallant words in all of history. Constantine, to surrender the city to you is beyond my authority or anyone else who lives within its walls. For all of us, after having taken the mutual decision, shall die out of free will without sparing our lives. And that's all the emperor said to the Sultan. It's just, this being a bookend to the Middle Ages is sort of kind of astonishing that is how an emperor, his fighting words are towards someone who's threatening extinction. I always find those words quite astonishing, actually, for myself.
Well, do bear in mind, though, that before the siege launched in earnest with the attacks, that Mehmed II offered them very generous terms of surrender and said that they would all be secure in their lives and property, and they were refused. So he made that statement. I'll be cursed as the Philo Turk, but he did make that statement before launching the attack, and so they were not at that point facing at least annihilation of their bodies or property. Depending on whether you would want to take the word of Mehmed. And he did offer a second opportunity for them to surrender under pressure from Halil Pasha much later in the siege.
That is true.
There was there is of course a logic behind that, which is more than just humanitarian. There are many other examples which we'll get to later, Semigog, regarding his conduct towards his enemies in terms of surrender. But one thing in particular is that the reason he would want Constantinople, of all cities, to surrender is to spare it from being looted, essentially, which is, of course, what happens. Because he wants Constantinople preserved because he envisages it as his obvious future capital. And so preserving the city intact without having to level it, without having to destroy it, keeping its treasures intact and not giving away, mutilating its population, raping them, etc. He has a vested interest in doing that. But of course, that doesn't happen. But regarding, keeping his, words with regards to, the life and property, more than that, he was affording, basically that the despotate of Morea, Mistras, would be independent into perpetuity. But as we can see, the despotate of Morea, despite being again under Demetrios, vassals of the Ottoman Empire, fell in 1460 and 1461. And again, the Komnenoi dynasty, I think, is a good example to show the limits of Mehmed II's mercy. But yes, it's an interesting question. But I think there was definitely a political reason as to why he, and again, to not deliberately, alienate his supporters and how to fight Ottomans within the city again. But all of these factors, I think, are important to consider.
Okay. Well, actually, before I sort of meander about the siege itself, I will actually read an extract. Sorry, I just couldn't find it in my notes before. It's actually a history on the Turks, written by Norman Stone. So I'll read this and then I'll sort of get into the meat and bones of the siege itself. There was already on the Asiatic side of the Bosphorus a great castle, and Mehmed constructed another one on the European side, Rumeli Hisari, which is what Semigog and Apostolica both mentioned. Much of it still in well restored existence. At a narrow point where his guns could sink anything that tried to get by, thus blocking access to the city from the Black Sea, the walls of Constantinople had in the past been an insuperable obstacle to besiegers, of whom, over the centuries, there had been many. They had been built up since Roman times and were in places treble in thickness, very dense and well sighted. In the sense that defenders could be concealed or would be able to make a sudden sally, An enemy fleet could not break into the Golden Horn because of a huge chain with floats. It impeded the way into the estuary. Its other end was fixed at Galata, which in the hands of the Genoese was neutral at this time. Then there was the defensive speciality, Greek fire. However, by 1453, these arrangements from resisting attack had been, if not overtaken, at least matched. Gunpowder had arrived from China in the 14th century, but guns were still very difficult to cast because, as you poured the iron, it might settle within tiny cracks that could prove fatal once the gun was used, and the cracks, in the heat of the explosion, expanded. James II of Scotland was killed in 1460 when his big gun exploded, and another great weapon, the Tsar cannon, now on display at the Kremlin, was never used, for example. Somehow, the Turks managed to make a workable monster. One Orban, the usual Hungarian, approached Constantine, offering his wares, but Constantine did not have any money and was unable to pay for his services. Mehmed II did. Orban created two monsters which, over a 3-month period, were dragged by a team of 60 horses and 300 men each from Edirne to a spot at the walls that was most vulnerable. A riverbed ran along, and the walls that had been shaped around it accordingly, which made for weaker construction and blind spots for the defenders. It was characteristic of Mehmed that he followed the construction of these monsters very closely, understanding the techniques used by Orban to prevent the development of any fissures in the metal. They were capable of firing a cannonball of vast weight, 450 kilos or 1,000 pounds. At this time, the French had not managed to fashion a cannonball of more than a modest weight, possibly 120 kilos or 250 pounds thereabouts, and it could only bounce off such walls as the Theodosian ones. However, these were only two of the largest. The Turks had a good number of lesser guns. So by that sort of token, you can understand the tremendous firepower difference. Although it should be said, and it's only come to my knowledge recently, that it wasn't a case that the Byzantines didn't have cannons either, but the ones that they had were rather smaller, and they had a limited supply of ammunition, so they were only used sparingly, whereas the Turks could essentially almost fire around the clock. And to the defenders of Constantinople too, the walls did suffer damage, but very often overnight or throughout the course of a day of non-fighting, the Byzantines would often repair the Theodosian walls, and they continued this for a month.
And sometimes they were sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, not at all. No.
It just sometimes that damage that you're referring to, they were so desperate to patch it that they had to do so with bales of hay that were covered with hides. Also, the author who was writing about iron, those early cannons of Mehmet's were bronze. And I've seen there's still one of them that sits outside of Rumelihisar, and which it's known as Boğaz Kesan, meaning the cutter of the throat, because the Bosphorus means Boğaz in Turkish means the Bosphorus, but it also means throat. The cannon is so damn large that one day when I was walking along the Bosphorus, because I used to live near Rumelihisar, I saw a homeless guy sleeping in it, which is a poetic image that I've been waiting for a poem to include it with. But the bore of them, the diameter is so large that a man can easily climb inside it and lie down.
Exactly, yeah. Actually, funny, just looking at the chat, yes, Orban was actually killed by one of the cannons exploding as well during the siege, unironically. And if I'm not mistaken, Semigog, I believe one of the surviving guns sits inside of the museum at the Topkapi Palace, right?
It may, and there may be some of them over, but there's a large selection of the cannons sitting outside at the Askeri Müzesi too. I'm not certain about which ones may have been manufactured properly by Orban, but there are any number of those older bronze cannons that you can see at the Askeri Müzesi, at Topkapı, I would imagine, and certainly outside of Rumelihisar itself.
So the siege more or less continues for the better part of a month throughout April, and the defenders are worn down. And despite the sort of allied contingents, you have Venetian contingents, you have Genoese contingents, you have the 2,000 Neapolitan archers, and another contingent which is actually kind of forgotten because it's hard to classify them, because Crete at this point was a possession of Venice, but the Cretans themselves obviously fellow Greeks. A number of Cretans, I believe anywhere from 200 to 300, made their way to Constantinople with a group of Venetian adventurers on, I think it was six or seven or eight or nine ships, under the leadership of one. Let me see if I can find his name. Under the leadership of one Manousos Kallikratis, and most of these fighters. So the 300 came from a place called Sfakia, which is quite a place steeped in history in all of Crete, and they say as many others as 700 Cretans managed to join the Venetian ships that ventured from Venice to Constantinople prior to the city being cut off. So you sort of more or less have 1,000 Cretans as a part of that force, which, when I read about the Cretan contingent, is why I sort of upped that estimation from 7,000, because I don't see how 7,000 fit within that number. Needless to say, there was a fateful day. It was the 28th of April, where I believe was either a full moon, like a blood moon, and the Byzantines sort of took this as quite a bad omen, and that was the last time, or the last evening, because on the morning the battle started, but they held mass in the Hagia Sophia, and interestingly enough, Catholics and East Orthodox had a joint ceremony in the church. And the morning of the 29th, which is the fall, I have the full speech from the Emperor, if I may, Apostolic.
Yes, absolutely. One just point to note at that point is that in the Mass in Hagia Sophia would have included the name of the Pope as well, because this was technically during that brief moment of time where the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches were in communion.
Oh, yes, indeed. Sorry, I meant to say May, not April. Sorry. So the 26th of May was the sort of the day that the Sultan had decided to attack the city with sort of one almighty assault, because, as we had alluded to before, the beyliks in Anatolia had started to get unrestful, and with this many troops tied up engaging the siege, Mehmed, although an ambitious sultan, was still a young sultan, and obviously had many enemies of his own, so he had to more or less have the siege concluded sooner rather than later.
29th of May. Yeah. It's
a
a holiday in Turkey, so I still remember it.
Yeah. So what I meant to say, like, the preparations began on the 26th of May, is what I meant to say. But the interesting thing about the 29th of May as a date is that even on that calendar year, because obviously the Orthodox Church still uses the old Julian calendar, fell on Pentecost, the day of the fall, and preluded by that full moon as well. So on one hand, the Greeks were highly inspired by fighting on Pentecost, and on another day they were sort of quite unnerved by the sight of the full moon, of the blood moon, which for them was, there's some, I can't actually remember the exact source of it, but it has something to do with some old sort of, not wives' tale, but a mythos about the fall of Constantinople and something to do with the full moon. I actually have forgotten about it, so bear with me. But on the morning of the 29th, they have their mass in the Hagia Sophia, and Constantine Palaiologos, the emperor, gives a speech in front of all of his contingents, and it's a bit of a long speech, so bear with me, but I'll try and say it as quick as possible. Gentlemen, illustrious captains of the army, and our most Christian comrades in arms, we now see the hour of battle approaching. You have always fought with glory amongst the enemies of Christ. Now the defense of your patrimony and of the city known to the world over, which the infidel and evil Turk have been besieging for 52 days, is committed to your lofty spirits. Be not afraid, because the walls have been worn down by the enemy's battering. For your strength lies in the protection of God. and you must show it with your arms quivering and your swords brandished against the enemy. I know this undisciplined... Sorry, pardon me a second. I know this undisciplined mob, as is their custom, shall rush upon you with loud cries and ceaseless volleys of arrows and javelins. These will do you no bodily harm, for I see that you are well covered in the best of armor. They will strike the walls, our breastplates, and our shields in vain. So do not imitate the Romans who, when the Carthaginians went into battle against them, allowed their cavalry to be terrified by the fearsome sight and sound of elephants. In this battle, you must stand firm and have no fear, no thought of flight, but inspired to resist evermore with Herculean strength. Animals may run away from other animals, but you are men, the truest of men, men of stout heart, and you will hold at bay these dumb beasts, thrusting and hurling your spears and javelins and swords into them, so that they will know that they are fighting not against their own kind, but against their masters, the descendants of Hellenes and Romans. You are aware that the impious and infidel enemy had disturbed the peace unjustly between us. He has violated the terms of treaty and oaths that he made with us. He has slaughtered our farmers at harvest time. He has erected a fortress on the Propontis, as it were to devour the Christians in our realm. He has encircled Galata under the pretense of peace. Now he threatens to capture the city of Constantine the Great, your fatherland, the place of ready refuge for all Christians, the guardian of all Hellenes, and to profane its holy places of profane its holy shrines of God by turning them into stables for his horses. O my lords, my brothers, my sons, the everlasting honor of Christians is in your hearts and in your hands. You men of Genoa, men of courage and famous for your infinite victories, you have always protected this city, your mother, in many conflicts with the Turks. Show now your prowess and your aggressive spirit towards them with manly vigor. You men of Venice, most valiant heroes, whose weapons have many a time made Turkish blood flow, and who have adorned this city as if it were your own with fine, outstanding men, lift high your spirits now for the battle at hand. You, my Greek brothers in arms, obey the commands of your leaders in the knowledge that this is the day of your glory, a day on which, if you should shed but a drop of blood, you will win for yourselves crowns of martyrdom and eternal fame. You must fight for these 4 things. Fight for your faith, fight for our country, fight for your king, and fight for your loved ones, your friends and family, for this is all that you can do. That's the speech given on the morning of the last day of the battle. And just to summarize the battle, actually, it is said that the Turks breached a part of the walls where the Genoese were, and that the Genoese commander was wounded, although not fatally at the time. That was Giovanni Giustiniani. He was taken away from the walls, and this was misinterpreted by both the Greeks in that portion of the wall and the Genoese, that they were faltering. And so at this time when the Mehmed had sent sort of more Anatolian auxiliaries to attack the walls, to just sort of soak up arrows and to try and get his siege towers and ladders up to the walls, he actually sent in the Janissaries for one last push. And even though the Genoese and the Greeks rallied at that sector where the Genoese were manning it, the infamous Kleptoporta gate was left open, or was forced open, something to that effect. No one really knows. And what the Janissaries managed to breach the gate threw up their flags, and that more or less broke the spirit of the defenders in that part of the city. And from that point onward, the battle was more or less lost. And there's another famous quotation by the emperor where he says, "The city has fallen, I am alive." And it's said that he threw off his regalia and with his companions charged into the midst of the Janissaries, and there was the fall of the city.
And fell, yes, unknown amidst all the rest of the fighting dead. To give the defenders fully their due, they had received in the course of that day a massive onslaught in 3 waves. First, Mehmed sent the Başıbozuks, which were essentially irregulars conscripted from bandits and criminals and, landless men and the rest. And they were used to, as you say, soak up arrows. Then he sent and that was a considerable assault in and of itself. And then in between these, there were further bombardments. Then he sent more like, regular troops. And then, as you say, he waited at the end to send his Janissaries. And even that was not sufficient because they had built wooden stockades to brace parts of the walls. The business I told you about, the bales of hay with skins over them. And they bombarded that, and only because they scored a lucky hit on the repairs of the wooden stockade, so it is said, did the Janissaries manage to get a foothold there after trying for quite some time and suffering considerable losses. And the business about the gate, there are various stories, but the most plausible one I've heard is that it had been left open after a flanking attack on the Turks outside the walls, and they had returned, and the Janissaries managed to capture that, and as you say, begin to wave their banners. And part of that was contained because Justiniani and the emperor himself, fighting beside him, rushed into the breach to defend it. So they fought all day long against massive odds.
And over the course of the last day of the battle, what just for anyone who's sort of interested in the tactical nitty gritty, the forces that the emperor had arrayed was that there was two small sort of reserves. There was one, I think, near the Church of the Holy Apostles, which was essentially elements of his bodyguard and some militia raised from the city. And then the Venetians had another small reserve themselves, not far from the ships, which would have been along the coastal wall. And this actually to the Cretians as quickly, actually, because if you look at this map here, that's can you go forward to the map, Apostolic? Sorry, actually,
yeah, sure. Sorry,
I had this whole discussion about the siege, and I never referenced the map once. So in the top part, you sort of see this bulge alongside the Golden Horn, the north part of the wall there that sort of bulges out. That's near the Blasane Palace. Which ended up being the palace used from the emperors from the Komnenoi onwards, more or less. And where that bulge is, there was sort of 3 major towers. Now, when these Cretians under Kallikratis made their way to the city, the emperor placed them in charge of these 3 towers that overlooked the walls in front of the Blokane. And it's said that when the emperor threw off his regalia and charged into the fray and was killed, it's said that when he was surrounded by the Janissaries, he yelled out to the Cretians, "Christians, Greeks, cut off my head. Take it, good Cretians, and carry it to Crete, for the Cretians to see. For the Cretians may see it and be sad at heart." That is a reference to the fact that when the banners started being unfurled on the walls and the defenders broke, everybody retreated away from the walls except the Cretians. And the Venetians, with some of the nobility and some of the people who had the money to pay, boarded the Venetian and Genoese galleys and sailed out whilst they could. And for the better part of the afternoon, whilst the Ottomans were still had begun to pillage the city, the Cretians actually held onto the Blokane district and that small sort of hub you see sticking out the walls there. Insofar, their resistance was so fierce that the Sultan actually had to offer them amnesty. So he admired their courage so bravely that he offered them essentially surrender for their lives without captivity. and it should be ironic that the Cretians, and for those who follow this stream, we've covered Greece from the Bronze Age till now. The Cretians have a colourful and an extraordinary history in service of of the Greek city states at many of the Greek battles in antiquity, under the service of the Antigonids and the Seleucids, even in Roman service. The Cretians would join the legions thereafter, and it's sort of ironic. It's almost a strange justice in a way that the last troops that surrender, or the last troops that fight on in the city, are the Cretians in the Blocane.
And anyone who doubts the valor of the people of Crete, you can, or this story, can look a little bit forward into history to the Ottoman attempt to take Crete, which happened sometime later, and we needn't go into. But the relevant point is that the majority of Crete fell pretty quickly to the Ottomans, but Candia, a Venetian stronghold, of course, garrisoned in large part by people of Crete, they held out for, I believe, just a hair over 20 years. So, they're rather fierce.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, because I actually have a friend of mine who's a Crete, from Crete, and one of his forebears was actually killed in one of the uprisings, or the one of John the Teacher, Diaska Iones, from I think the 1750s or whenabouts. So the Cretians have a very even under the Ottoman yoke, have a proud tradition of not capitulating and of maintaining their traditions when all is lost, and they proved their valor most certainly during this siege. And of course, it goes without saying that the emperor is killed. Strangely enough, his body's never recovered; it's never found, which plays into the king under the mountain sort of mythos that Frederick Barbarossa has, and Konstantinos Palaiologos has. There's a number of others who fit into that category. And I don't know if you want to touch on it, Apostolic. I know we're an hour in, but you have the surrender of Lucas Notaris, the last megas dukes of the empire, to the Sultan.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you want to elucidate on that at all, or do you want me just to continue?
No, just there's actually just one point. Maybe Semigog can help me, because I've been thinking about your prophecy of the waxing moon, and just looking at it briefly. Apparently, there was a prophecy which indicated that as so long as the moon was waxing, then the city of Constantinople could never fall. And then on May the 22nd, the moon enters into some form of eclipse, and thereafter the moon wanes, and that coincides with the final assault. But there's one just weird coincidence which you might enlighten me on, Semigog. Of course, Constantinople was a Roman rededication of the Megaran colony of Byzantium. Megara was founded, I believe, by the city of Corinth, and Corinth also founded the city of Syracuse in Sicily, which also had a near identical incident during the Peloponnese War. And of course, the link during that, of course, is the symbol of Constantinople is the crescent moon, which will later be adopted by the Ottomans and as a symbol of Islam. And of course, that is a symbol associated with the Roman goddess Artemis. So I have all of these little elements, but there's no sort of concrete linking thread. But nevertheless, all of these weird consistencies.
There is a linking thread, and actually one of the great ironies is that the conventional symbol of Islam is today taken to be the crescent and star, which is entirely a misunderstanding relating to Constantinople itself. Of course, the original old symbol of Islam is simply a crescent. There is no associated star. And it was only once standing upon the beach near Corinth in my Greek family's old hometown of Kiato that I saw a very strange thing where there's actually an astronomical term for it, but essentially the sun strikes the surface of the moon in such a fashion that when seen from the earth, it forms a crescent on one side and just the beginning of a winking on the other side of the moon of what looks like a star. And it was only when I physically saw that I understood where it came from. But the goddess of Byzantium, one of the goddesses, or a major one, was Hecate. and Hecate is the guardian of barriers. So she represents the person who dwells on the border between the living and the dead, but also between the civilized and the wild. And she was considered to be a guardian of the walls themselves in these pagan periods. And so once when Philip of Macedon was attacking Byzantium, they were attempting to steal up on the walls. And so the story goes, they were spotted by the defenders because of the full moon, and also warned by the barking of dogs. So there is a long-standing tradition there, and I think maybe even I mentioned this in one of our past streams about Istanbul. But there's a long-standing tradition that is almost entirely unconscious on the part of the people who still live there, that the walls or the city will stand so long as they are protected by Hecate, and dogs will give warning. So even Turks today will tell you stories about how they knew that an earthquake was coming because all the dogs began to bark. And of course, that would signal that the walls might fall. It's like a warning from the goddess. Of course, none of them will tell you about this background on it. But Hecate is the guardian of barriers and walls. And there was actually one of the gates of ancient Byzantium that had a statue of, in the land walls, that had a statue of Hecate placed there with her associated torches, because she's sort of the guardian of limits and borders. And indeed, on the old coinage of Byzantium, you'll see the crescent and star. And as I said, it's again a great irony that the Muslims, as far away as Pakistan, think of the crescent and star as their own symbol, when there is no question that it's a pagan symbol. And indeed, the idea of a woman who protects the city survived in the days of the Christian Constantinople, where it was considered the queen of cities, and the figure of Mary was strongly associated with it. So there's quite a bit going on there.
Indeed.
So thank you very much for that, Semigog. It's a wonderful sort of link to the proto origins of the city with the original Corinthian settlers there. Thank you.
Just on that very quickly for me, Apostolic. You see that symbol too of the crescent moon and a star. It does crop up in Byzantine elements of Byzantine heraldry. Now, I can't remember what family, if it's the Coressio family, or one of the other, maybe perhaps associated with the parts of the Macedonian dynasty. I can't remember, but that does crop up, the moon with the star. And also, as much as it is associated with Constantinople itself and the goddess Hecate, it does have origins also in Anatolia. I can't remember if it was with the Lycians or the Carians, but it's also an Anatolian symbol that with sort of with the Greek influence over Anatolia and this sort of enmeshing between pre-Greek Anatolian cultures and the Greeks themselves in Anatolia, that this sort of becomes a Greek symbolism that then becomes a part of the, or concurrently is a tradition of Constantinople that becomes essentially an emphasis of or metamorphosizes itself predominantly into a symbol of Constantinople. And sort of like the both of you have said, it's kind of ironic that what is certainly by the medieval period, what is associated with strongly being an East Roman symbol of Constantinople and of Anatolia sort of metamorphosizes down the track as being a symbol of Islam, and those who would know no better would think nothing of it than seeing it today and just associating it with Islam, which is sort of not particularly correct.
Yeah, not particularly correct. It's a deep irony, and it makes me laugh every time I see it, that the Muslim world has adopted as its symbol the mark of the Eastern Roman Empire.
Oh, sorry. Just in the chat, Ionis Palalogos, yes, Dalasenos, thank you. I just couldn't think of the family. Thank you, mate.
Anyway, without further ado, because we're running late, sadly, I have to get on to the slaughter of the city. So, as is customary, there were 3 days for which the city was attacked and by the forces now, rampaging all over the city. The population, roughly, of the sort of 50,000 people there, roughly 30,000 people were killed and enslaved. There was complete bedlam. There was wholesale rape. There were refugees huddling in the churches such as the Hagia Sophia, for sanctuary, and the Ottomans burst into these places and began to rape all the women. And of course, they were then sold off as slaves throughout the empire. And one of the eyewitnesses we have is one George Srantzes, who of course had been a courtier of Mehmed II, of John VIII, and of Constantine XI, and had gone off in person to negotiate many of the ultimately fruitless alliances with all the other Christian states. And he says, on the third day after the fall of our city, the Sultan celebrated his victory with a great joyful triumph. He issued a proclamation. The citizens of all ages who had managed to escape detection were to leave their hiding places throughout the city and come out into the open, as they were to remain free and no question would be asked. He further declared the restoration of houses and property to those who had abandoned our city before the siege. If they returned home, they would be treated according to their rank and religion, as if nothing had changed. So essentially, to the survivors who weren't enslaved, who hadn't been killed during this original pillage, they were to be again receive the token of the Sultan's mercy. And this is the predicament that Mehmed was in, was that he was in a desperate need to repopulate the city. Now he was going to rededicate it as his capital, and the first thing, of course, was to lead a major depopulation of the city, so much so that even with this promise of protection and return to property, many of the Greeks who were able to survive the initial onslaught never came back to the city. And as a result, towards the end of Mehmed's life, you have a series of forced importations. If I remember rightly, there's a word particular, sujun. So for example, you had Turks from Aksari who were imported wholesale into Constantinople, and of course that is now given the name of a region of the city itself. The old city of Constantinople, as far as I believe, is the Fethi district after the Conqueror, and this essentially means that by 1478 you have a population which is roughly double since pre-conquest levels, but the vast majority of that number is Muslim. You have a large Jewish contingent, and you have a dwindling Christian contingent in the city. So essentially, the entire city throughout the reign of Mehmed II is changed forever. But this isn't just a conquest and a repopulation of the city. Mehmed adopts the title of Caesarium, or Caesar of Rome, or Caesar of the Romans, rather, based on his acquisition of the cities. And just, why does he do this, essentially? He tries to draw some, you've already mentioned the Semigog, the link between the royal houses and the Ottomans. Interestingly enough, that was actually very weak when it comes to the Ottoman house itself. Mehmed II claimed descent from Theodora Katigozenos, who was one of the spouses of the Emperor Orhan. But of course, he was not descended from Theodora Katigozenos, because Theodora Katigozenos was one of the many consorts of the Sultan Orhan. So he tried to claim a very spurious link to the Komnenoi during the 12th century, which, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing to prove that at all. So really, we have a imperial, the assuming of the imperial title by right of conquest. And of course, he cites the example of Heraclius, deposing Phocas in the year 1610 during the height of the Sasanian Wars to prove this. And I think, obviously, this is something he very consciously tried to emulate. And what we see thereafter, Marcus, is a policy to eliminate all the last vestiges of political Romanitas within the Eastern Roman world, essentially. So we have still, after the conquest of Constantinople and the enslavement and rape of much of its population, what to do with the situation, the despotate of Moria and Mystaras, because Thomas and Demetrios, the brothers of Constantine, are still alive and ruling the despotate in tandem. Essentially, they're so incompetent at one point that, again, there was a revolt by the local Wallachian, Albanian, and Greek population, essentially, against the reign of Thomas and Demetrios. And this, again, is actually supported by the Ottomans. And the Ottomans are in this also weird situation of periodically aiding the two brothers in defeating various riots and aiding in others, essentially. But essentially what we see from 1453 to 1461 is a destabilization of the Despotate of Morea and leading into its eventual and complete conquest. Manuel, one of the Thomas, one of the younger brothers who had been an effective ally to Constantine XI, flees to Rome and appeals to help, while Demetrios, the one who was continually trying to usurp his brother, is basically pensioned off, taken to Adrianople, and lives out the rest of his life in a rather luxury exile. Again, pointing to that question you raised earlier, Semigog, about the consistency in Mehmed II treating his allies. And of course, there is the novel situation where you have various branches of the Paleologos dynasty. You have the imperial branch, which is descended from Manuel II, and you have the Paleologos of Monteferrat, which will last until, I believe, the middle of the 16th century. But the imperial branch is quite remarkable. After Thomas dies in Rome, he has a young son, Manuel, who essentially there was a crisis of succession in the Paleologos dynasty, because despite having produced so many male children, Manuel, but virtually all of the offspring of those 6 sons were daughters. There was an abundance of daughters for marrying, but there were seldom any sons. But Thomas finally produces a son, Manuel, whose sole significant achievement is to go back to Constantinople and beg for the mercy of the Sultan. And him and his son, Andreas, actually, I believe, convert to Islam, Andreas renaming himself to Mehmet Pasha. And thereafter, any sort of mention of the direct line of the Paleologos dynasty falls away. So despite that very dramatic ending with Constantine XI, we have that rather anticlimactic branch of the Paleologos dynasty returning cup in hand to pay homage to the new Kayserirum. And the flip side of that, of course, is what happened to the Komnenoi, because you mentioned, of course, that the Empire of Trebizond had been, involved with, the various Turkoman tribes. In particular, in the east, we had the rise of the Black Sheep Turkomans, who eventually gave way to the White Sheep Turkomans under the control of the Darius-like king Uzun Hasan.
This being the Akulunyu and the Karakulunyu.
Yes.
Yes.
The Karakonyulu are the black sheep and the Akonulu are the white sheep, as far as I'm aware. And in line with this, policy of alliances, John IV, the penultimate emperor of Trebizond, marries his daughter Theodora Megale, who later becomes Despina Khanum, to become the queen of Uzun Hasan. And this, informs, we'll talk about probably next week, the beginning of the Safavid Wars, because Uzun Hasan begins as a powerful ruler in eastern Anatolia. And by the end of the 1460s, he takes control of Iran briefly before ultimately his dynasty is replaced by the Safavids a few decades later. And through his marriage to Theodora Megale Komnenoi, the Uzun Hasan is basically pitted against the Ottomans, and very successfully, Mehmed II is able essentially to detach Uzun Hasan from Trebizond, actually involving a diplomatic intervention of his mother, basically arguing whether Trebizond is worth saving, whether it's so irrelevant almost as to defend. And of course, after the detachment of Uzun Hasan from his allies, and you can say the betrayal of this marriage pact, this alliance by marriage, Trebizond does what Constantinople had been offered to it, which was surrender, on the condition that David, who is the last emperor of the Trebizonders, receives a pension, a comfortable life in Adrianople, and has his property retained. But of course, it doesn't go so well for the Komnenoi, because now you have a successful Komnenoi dynasty. You have David and his 3 sons who have moved to Adrianople. And also, given the fact that you're basing your tenuous claim to be Caesar of Rome on a link with the Komnenoi dynasty, elevating them whilst also having the Komnenoi in such close proximity was a major concern for Mehmed. So in all likelihood,
It's worth taking note too, because I mean, for those who were here for the previous stream as well, we don't just have the Komnenoi, the Megos Komnenoi being emperors in Trebizond. They are descendants of the Komnenoi dynasty that were ruling the entire East Roman Empire at one point, as in they were descendants of Alexios and John II.
Well, they were the greatest of the late Byzantine emperors, because you had the Paleologos dynasty, despite being the longest lasting, ironically, of all the East, probably all the Roman dynasties, it was the weakest, and of course the Komnenoi was spared the embarrassment of the Angoloi and their tenure under the sack of Constantinople. So the Komnenoi are associated with Alexios and the Restoration. They're associated with John the Good. They're associated with Manuel I. And so there is this great legacy that they can harken back to. Essentially, they have a genealogical pedigree which supersedes that of essentially any of the other, claimants to the
of any Greek or Turk for that matter.
Yes, exactly. And so rather than allowing them to live in peace, in all likelihood we have a forgery perpetrated by Mehmed to implicate David and his sons in some form of conspiracy whereby Uzun Hasan through Despina Khanum would try and rescue the various Komnenoi princes. And using this pretext and the convenient discovery of this said letter, all the males of the family were promptly imprisoned and executed in 1463. And Anna Megali, the daughter of the last Emperor David, was sent into the harem, the imperial harem, briefly. And then she was basically handed around to various prominent nobles within the Ottoman house as basically a gift by Mehmed II. So to answer your question, Semir, there's definitely a flip side to the mercy. And again, like we see with Constantinople, he offered, to the Trebizonders this great sort of declaration of eternal peace, yet at the same time, preparing for war. So Mehmed II is a complicated character, to say the least. But in this case, he was utterly brutal.
But on that, the question, oh, sorry, go Semir.
All I was something I wanted to throw in from a bit earlier, other than just agreeing with Apostolic Majesty, that I certainly didn't think that Mehmed the Conqueror was a man with a warm heart. It was certainly a matter of opportunism and seeking to have his plans realized. But one thing I wanted to throw in from earlier in terms of his claim to have blood relations with Christian rulers previously and to have a fair claim there, you guys will certainly know it, but Mehmed II had red hair and gray or blue eyes. And his mother was not of any noble or important family. His two older brothers had good claims to noble blood and rulership and the rest. But he did not. He was the child of a slave, almost certainly a European one. And it's entirely possible that his mother was a Christian. And so that is something to bear in mind in terms of his view of himself as uniting this empire with a number of different groups involved with it, in terms of their ethnicities and the rest. And just to plug in a little note, you'll probably be talking about it later, AM, if I know you, but Mehmed essentially began to codify Ottoman law, and this was finally completed under the figure of Suleiman, known as the lawgiver, Kanuni. They call him Kanuni Suleiman among the Turks. But that approach that Mehmed took was based on the idea of the raya, which were these were the different flocks, so to speak, as though all the different populations of the empire, each was a flock. And then within those flocks, they had subdivisions that they called millet, which is a nation, sort of in the sense of ethnos. So it's just something I wanted to throw in there earlier because you talked about his claim and how it was highly unlikely that anyone would...
and you are completely correct. You have completely anticipated what the next point was. Just to quickly summarize, Marcus, we also have the fall of the Gothic Peritea in the form of Theodoro, one of the last remnants, not only of East Germanic civilization, but the lingering sort of legacy of the Empire of Trebizond in 1475, which corresponds with his consolidation of the Crimea, which we'll get to later when talking about the general conquests of Mehmed II. And of course, the other is the fall of the Despotate of Epirus in 1479. Of course, the Despotate had fallen out of the hands of the Komnenoi Dukos and was now held by Italian princes. But nevertheless, all of these rump dynasties, the successor states after the original sack, have all of them have been defeated conclusively by Mehmed II. So if nothing else, he has that claim by right of conquest. And this gets on to the creation of the Miletirum, and bringing us back to George Scalarius and Gennadius II. Essentially, he is created as an ethnarch of the Millet, or a Bashi. And why is this significant? Because of course you've had the removal of the Paleologos dynasty, so now in a manner again of the the traditional form of the Caesar Papist Roman emperor. As Caesar of Rome, Mehmed II is going to govern as basically the supreme arbiter of religious matters within the empire, essentially. Of course, this isn't just relating to Christians, this is of course relating to Muslims, and not just Christians in general, but the different millets within Christianity itself. So eventually, we have the Miletirum, which basically corresponds to Eastern Orthodox or Greek Orthodox Christians. This appellation, of course, of Greek Orthodox is not Greek in the ethnic sense, it's Greek Rite, albeit there are some people who advocate there was a Greek hierarchy within the millet. Then, of course, you have the Armenian Coptic Church in the east, which would have their own millet. And again, there would be many attempts to establish some form of Catholic millet within the empire, especially after the annexation of Bosnia in 1463. But the effect, this is very significant because, of course, within Islamic civilization, you have Jews and you have Christians who are considered as the dhimmi, or basically the protected groups who are afforded some form of right to worship, albeit they have to pay the jizya for the privilege of doing so. And the effect of Gennadius, the restoration of the patriarchate under Gennadius, and his submission to Mehmed and his endorsement of Mehmed, basically meant that the church had become dependent on a non-Christian ruler, on the Muslim Caesar Irum. And this ultimately had the effect of removing all of the progress, you can argue, that had been made regarding the union of the church before the conquest, and represented an ultimate schism with Rome, and basically the fact that the Eastern Orthodox Church had now become isolated from the rest of Christendom. But it moves beyond that. I think one of the sort of obvious signs of this, showing that the unequal relationship and how reliant on the Sultan's goodwill Gennadius II was, and how this relationship was unequal. After the conquest, you have the reconversion of the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. Of course, the Hagia Sophia being not the oldest, but the most prominent of all the cathedrals in Constantinople. In 1463, from that point, the Church of the Holy Apostles, I believe the oldest cathedral within the city, which had been rebuilt many times, once by Justinian, once by Basil I, that became the center of the ethnarch Gennadius. But that in turn in 1461 was demolished to make way for the Fethi Mosque, which you can see on the left-hand side here. And as a result of that, the patriarch was then moved again to the Pamaskaritos Church, which again, a century later, was converted into a mosque by Murad III. Again, if nothing else, demonstrating through the constant, conversion of all these holy sites, how completely, you could say on the one hand that Semigog, that Christians did have some form of protection, yet at the other hand, you're basically making some form of Faustian pact when you basically subordinated your religion to again, not a hostile religion in this case, but a religion which is definitely creating a system of caste in which your religion is definitely subordinate. And so the idea of having an emperor in the sense of Constantine is completely sort of undone here. And I think the other side to sort of bring in here is the idea of the blood tax, the child levy. the Deveshirme, which you mentioned earlier. The Deveshirme wasn't created by Mehmed II. In terms of where the system comes from, within the early days of the Ottoman dynasty, where the Ottoman dynasty had basically been nothing more than bandits under Osman himself, you had the expansion of the slavery system throughout the Ottoman Beylik, who the Kul, essentially acquiring slaves through conquest and through banditry, essentially. But once you have the consolidation of a stabilized sedentary empire, which has moved beyond, essentially banditry, during the reign of Murad I, you have the creation of the Janissaries. And the significance of the Janissaries, of course, is that they are a formerly Christian slave elite guard who will then convert to Islam, who owe no loyalty, again, kind of like Gennadius, other than to the person of the Sultan himself. He has no constituency other than relying on the Sultan for that power. And what we're seeing with the Deveshirme is an embellishment upon these two systems, whereby as we move into a vast new empire with the acquisition of all of these new territories, which now involves, will ultimately come to include the Balkans and Anatolia, and ultimately it'll become much larger under the reign of Selim the Grim. You have a consolidated settled empire, and you can now draw levies from your conquered Christian populations, and this is the Deveshirme system. So typically, if you were over the age of 8 and you were, from age of 8 to an adolescent, you could be, essentially enrolled as a slave and, to serve in the palace, to serve in the government, to serve in the military, essentially, into all of these various branches. The effect of this is that these slaves would, be given an education. Eventually, they'll be forced to convert to Islam. Some would be sent to the palace and the harem, and they'll be castrated. Of course, I believe that Muslims cannot castrate other Muslims. So in addition to these Christian slaves who are castrated, you also have the black eunuchs who were acquired from the east coast of Africa, who again, weren't Muslim and so were allowed to be castrated. The effect of this, of course, is that you have an entire bureaucracy, an entire military system, and of course an intellectual system, because many of these former Christian slaves would convert to Islam and they would become Islamic clerics, is that you have an entire class of people who are slaves to the Sultan, in addition to the harem, which represents basically the breeding center of the empire. You have a intellectual, military, and governmental elite, which is entirely dependent on the Sultan. And what the effect of Mehmed's reign is, essentially, is a massive expansion of this into something far more systematic and consolidated. And I bring this back to the figure we mentioned very early on in the stream, which is Kandali Halil Pasha, who was executed soon after the fall of Constantinople. Before then, essentially, the post of a Grand Vizier had been occupied by, a prominent Turkic noble. But once you have the execution of Kandali Halil Pasha, his successor is Zaganos, who is a Greek Christian who was the product of this system, essentially. And the successor of Zaganos is, of course, the poet Adni, who would adopt the name Muhammad Pasha, but himself would be Greek and actually claim some form of distant relation to the Angloid dynasty. So what we're seeing, and again, bringing this back to Kanunname, the law of the book, sorry, the book of law, where we have this Ottoman imperial law system, which is trying to transcend just Sharia and find a way to organize some form of systematic secular governance between all of these different groups, all of these different millets, in terms of trying to link this back to some sort of continuity between the Byzantine Empire and the new sort of Ottoman Caesarship. I think it's important to understand that Kanun is not some form of, reinvention of Roman law or based on that. It's very important to understand that it is siyasa. It is a secular system of law which is meant to supplement the various shortcomings of Sharia in terms of the politics and the running of the empire. In the way that you can say that the harem is actually inherited from the Byzantine gyneconitis, And this is not like an Ottoman invention. This is a very early import. We can date this all the way back to the Abbasid system and the importation of some form of Byzantine ritual. So these are all coming back through this long sort of connection of essentially the trade between ideas between the Muslim world and the Byzantine world, all culminating here. And the effect of this is that Mehmed II has a deracinated slave bureaucracy and army. And of course, his prominent ministers, his Diwan, his court, are all made up of this class. So he is able to rely on them to organize and manage his empire in a way which, again, isn't related to place, it isn't related to class. You have an entire group who are solely dependent on the Sultan. So I've been conscious I've been speaking for a very long time. Is there anything either of you would want to embellish upon those points, or maybe contradict me or whatever?
Just two. One is that you're absolutely right about the way in which there was, the metaphor that's often used in certain circles about the Cthulhu always swimming left or the ratchet always turning in one direction. That was very much the case in terms of the condition and status of Eastern Christians in the empire, Western ones for that matter, and it remains to this day. So, for example, they have laws on the books which, they build it. Even Turkish Muslims complain about the number of mosques that they build every day. In Istanbul, I'm exaggerating a bit, but everywhere in the city, there's constantly a new mosque going up. Whereas by law, you cannot, for example, even today, build without a great deal of effort, and it's usually thwarted, any new church or synagogue, any new church of any kind. And it even becomes difficult to maintain the existing historical structures because money is not apportioned for that. So there's kind of the attitude of let it stay, but we'll just kind of throttle it slowly over time. So that's just by way of reinforcing your point you made about the plight of the Christians in these circumstances. So I would imagine that there was probably hope held out for Mehmet, looking more like a European, being said, at least in some of the versions, to have had a Christian slave mother. There were early deputations that went to him hoping to, convince him crazy things like that Islam and Christianity were more or less interchangeable, or at very least they should coexist as sister religions and things. And I think all the people who had the ideas about pushing that program forward were quickly disabused of their hopes about it. The second thing to point out about the Janissaries, I just add further dimensions. Yes, they were in theory entirely dependent on the Sultan, as Machiavelli famously observed.
Sorry, Semigog. I do want to iterate that I'm only referring to the 15th century and early 16th century Janissaries. I'm not referring to the later Janissaries. Well,
but yes, of course, they became much worse later, and they were famed for the ritual act would be to turn over their cooking pots on their tripods over their fires, which was a symbol of rebellion. So where they were camped, they would basically kick over their cooking pots, and that would signal that they were coming after the Sultan, being upset about something. And so, yes, it certainly got worse later, but it is worth pointing out two things. One, that Mehmed had problems with the Janissary Corps from the beginning, and even faced rebellion from them shortly before going after Constantinople, which forced him to have to push a number of them out and then raise the salaries, setting a horrible precedent for himself, and that caused all kinds of affliction to subsequent sultans. He had to raise their salaries to satisfy them. So he had been having problems with them already, even in the 15th century. And then the other point that's worth outlining, I'm not sure when it occurred. So, it may be important to come in later and figure out, exactly what the point was. Maybe it was already the case at this point. Perhaps it happened shortly, a short time later. But the Janissaries were very much riddled with Bektashi dervishes. So the Janissaries themselves were associated with a Sufi religious order that recognized 12 imams. And so while they were nominally, of course, and in some cases more so, dependent on the Sultan, they could easily go their own ways. And they were associated with a network of dervish sort of lodges, I guess you could call them, that were spread all across the Balkans and other parts of the Ottoman Empire called tekkes. And so while they were nominally Muslim, they were a part of a Sufi faith that was deeply rooted in the Balkans. And I'll just leave it with this: many, many years later, if you look at the archaeology of Balkan regions, for example, in former Yugoslavia, you have the old idea of the Bogomils as a heresy. And you have the idea of these tekke and dervish houses. And so what I'm saying is the same region that the Bektashis and the Janissaries are associated with gave you major heresies later for Christendom. And so it's perfectly reasonable to imagine, it's something more than a slight suspicion, that there was all sorts of dissimulation and veiled belief and esoteric teachings going on within the Bektashi order that would make it something of a question mark, despite the fact that you're entirely right about its elite status, the rank to which these people could rise, and the important role they played in the empire.
Absolutely. I think one can draw to the later conflict with Selim the Grim and I believe it was the Sekulu rising at the 1511, I think. And of course, you have the Alevism in Turkey, if I'm pronouncing that right, which is a heterodox branch, which isn't quite Shiite and isn't quite Sunni at the same time. And of course, this is almost, I believe, unique to Turkey. But again, this is, I would say, a Kizilbash Turkoman phenomena in Anatolia rather than the Balkan phenomena. But yes, absolutely. I think just one final point to make regarding continuity. Of course, Mehmed II establishes Topkapı Palace, and in terms of often you'll receive in the West the appellation of the port, the high port, or the sublime port, just in terms of the origin of this. Traditionally, from the imperial palace, or whether it be the Palace of the Black Knight, which later became the Palaiologos residence, and of course the last stand in the siege, edicts would be read from the main gate of the palace, and this system was imitated consciously by Mehmed II. And as a result of this, of course, port is French for the gate. And of course, the reason we get this this idea in the West essentially is through the Franco-Ottoman alliance during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. Again, just linking back to there's some sort of Byzantine continuity, but in terms of diplomatic channels in particular, Mehmed II was very anxious that members of his diplomatic chancellery speak Greek, effectively because, as we've elucidated greatly, the Byzantine Empire had extensive diplomatic connections with the various Italian states, whether they be Venice, whether they be Florence. And rather than replace all these diplomatic channels, the Sultan essentially wanted to essentially inherit the organization and utilize the system of Byzantine diplomacy or Byzantine soft power, which he had now acquired through his conquest of the city. So, and of course, one other point to mention, going back to the thumbnail of this image, is of course that Mehmed II was very focused on the Italian states from a cultural point of view, involving patronizing certain artists such as Bellini, and again, in the rather novel situation for an Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid and Selim would definitely not continue this practice. But if it's possible, Marcus, I'd now like to get on to what will ultimately be the final section of this conversation, which is talking about the conquest of the Balkans. Now, we spent 2 hours on Mehmed II and the siege. So what I'll do is we were going to talk briefly about Selim Yavuz, and I think I'm going to leave that as a prelude to next week's discussion, so we have enough time to really flesh out the interesting personalities we have in terms of the Ottoman onslaught and the incredible amount of resistance that Mehmed II encountered after his consolidation of the city in 1453. Just to quickly introduce, the first target, of course, is the Despotate of Serbia, the Brankovic Despotate of Serbia. Whilst the Despotate itself was systematically acquired over a process of 5 years, Mehmed II tried to follow up his victory in Constantinople by attacking the Hungarian-held city of Belgrade. in 1456. And this ultimately completely failed, and he was pushed back by John Hunyadi. John Hunyadi would later die, and he was replaced by his son, Matthias Corvinus. But also we'll have, in terms of like the great personalities, the great nations after the fall of Serbia, we have Wallachia in the north, as you can see here, which later becomes a vassal of Mehmed II. We have Moldavia, which is to the northeast of Wallachia. We have Skanderbeg and the Venetians in Albania. And of course, well, essentially those are the main figures we're going to be discussing. Of course, you know, I'm sure everyone in the chat has heard of Dracula. I'm sure some wouldn't have, you know, had that much of an inkling as to his true origins, unless you've been misfortunate enough to watch that film. I think it was called Dracula Untold or something like that, which actually plays into the conflict, the origins of Vlad Dracul and his conflict with the Ottomans. Essentially, you have a similar, if you watched our stream on the Germans, a similar situation to Arminius, whereby during the 1430s and 1440s, the Wallachians, you know, the tributaries of the Ottoman Empire, had sent over Vlad and his brother Radu to be hostages of Murad II. And during that time, Vlad, who would later become Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, was essentially, he was a direct contemporary of Mehmed II. I believe they were nearly the same age, and would have spent time in court together. Yet when he's finally released and comes back and reclaims his homeland in 1456, he begins a reign of terror in Wallachia by eliminating many of the Wallachian nobles who were prepared to support the Hungarians or the Turks, essentially.
It's worth mentioning his father was assassinated too in the year prior.
Yes, which precipitates his return, essentially, and his acquisition of power. It's important to note that Wallachia is an incredibly fraught political position. Essentially, it's on the crossroads between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, the two major powers in this region. And so periodically, John Hunyadi, later Matthias Corvinus, and Mehmed II, later Bayezid, would want to influence this region and place a local ruler who was amenable to him. And as a result, Vlad the Impaler is deposed many times. He is briefly prince during his childhood in 1448, only to be deposed, only to be again come back in 1456. But 1456 to 1462 is the main reign of interest, really, because after we have essentially Mehmed believes that because of the history between these two, Vlad will be amenable to Ottoman influence within the principality. Of course, he is completely unamenable to the demands of Mehmed to pay homage, and responds to the demand by impaling the envoys of Mehmed. Hence, Vlad the Impaler. He is known, among all else, for mass impaling of his enemies. And he begins.
May I add?
Oh yeah, sure.
Just a quick point about him. There's very good reason for him to have despised the Ottomans. As you say, he was sent as a hostage, but so was his brother Radu, who was also known as Radu the Handsome. And there are stories that circulate that he became a catamite for Mehmed II, Radu, that is, not Vlad. And so that would explain, shall we say, bad blood. Another thing in support or that must be mentioned regarding Dracula or Vlad is that Sepesh, is that he the practice of impalement or impaling his captives, that was, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, he picked that up from the Ottomans.
Yes,
so
exactly.
he's called the crass and evil and dark one today, but he picked that up from the Ottomans themselves and used it well against them. And just one last thing, having been at court, as you say, as a hostage, he became quite fluent in Turkish. And not only was he tactically brilliant in any number of ways, as I suspect Marcus is about to talk to us about, being able to speak Turkish, one of the ways he would often take a Turkish fortress was by cunning. He would ride up with his troops pretending to be a Turk, shouting to be let in, claiming to be pursued by himself. and would thereby get them to open up their fortress, and he would take it in that fashion.
Yes, absolutely. And very important points to make. Sorry, I didn't mean to imply that impaling was a novel strategy for Vlad. And again, like Arminius, who was an auxiliary within the Roman within the Roman forces, I believe, under the Emperor Augustus, you see this imitation understanding of Turkish tactics and his masterful ability to use it against them. So he begins a preemptive strike into Bulgaria, Ottoman-held Bulgaria. And this precipitates a response by Mehmed II in person. And Vlad, I'm sure Marcus could elucidate on this more, but Vlad's essential strategy here is to attempt to capture the Ottoman Sultan at Targovisti. And this is a devastating nighttime raid. I believe there are roughly about 15,000 Turkish casualties. It debilitates Mehmed's ability to press further into Wallachia. But the ultimate objective being, capture the Sultan, end the war, is not achieved. Is there anything, Marcus, you would like to embellish on that very overly simplified summary?
Actually, sorry, I hate to do this. Can you just give me 2 minutes, guys? I'll be right back in a second. Sorry, my dog's downstairs. I'll be right back.
There's something I can certainly add to it.
Wonderful.
If I may, the Turks in strength were advancing on Vlad, and this is of course rough country and much of it very forested. And as he's advancing, he comes upon any number. If I'm not confusing historical events, I'm fairly sure it was this same campaign that Vlad lined the roads with thousands of impaled men that the Turks had to march forward looking at, and it was a veritable forest of men. And of course, with impaling as a form of execution, it takes you quite a long time to die in misery. So you can imagine what a forest of thousands of impaled men must have looked like. Worse still, if we're to be permitted to imagine it, sounded like and smelled like. And as the Turks are advancing, they, of course, they're getting kind of a strange feeling about all of this, as though they might hear their mothers calling them and might wish to go somewhere else. They camp for the night, and I'm sure Marcus will be able to tell us more. But as I understand it, Vlad very, very boldly just attacked directly into the camp, making his way for the Sultan's tent, and in the course of it, did incredible damage. It was as bold and brazen as anything that can be imagined. It is frankly one of my favorite historical stories. And despite the fact that he did not succeed in capturing the Sultan, the aspect of the story that I like the most is immediately after going through all of that, the Turks were like, nah, let's pack up. Nope, let's go home. And they turn tail.
Yes, it's kind of interesting, really, how Dracula meets his demise after this very dramatic and successful campaign against Mehmed II, because you mentioned Radu the Catamite, Radu the Handsome. Radu was unleashed as the political opponent of Vlad Draculisti. Radu, despite his relationship with Mehmed II, to put it nicely, was willing essentially to be that loyal puppet which Mehmed II wanted. So rather than dealing with Vlad the Impaler directly, Radu was essentially used to win over the support of the terrorized Wallachian nobility. And so using this essentially strategy of appealing and undermining Vlad's allies, Radu was able to rather successfully, after this failed attempt to get Mehmed, regain control of the country. In response to that, Vlad retreats to Hungary and appeals to Matthias Corvinus to lead a counterstrike against the Ottomans. But rather than do that, Matthias Corvinus, for various reasons, again due to this ongoing conflict between the possession of Hungary and the fact that Vlad the Impaler would not countenance submitting his kingdom, his principality, to Hungary, is imprisoned. And yes, Marcus is back. Marcus, would you like to embellish a bit more on the night attack at Targovista?
Do you want to just continue? Because you're mid-sentence. I can elucidate a little bit afterwards if you want to keep going.
Sure. I've just summarized how basically the aftermath of the battle, how Radu was able, as an extension of the power of Mehmed II, to undermine the Wallachian nobles and convince them to turn against Vlad the Impaler. But of course, this is the aftermath. The actual effect is, looking at Vlad's, almost successful attempt to capture Mehmed and debilitate his army to such an extent that he kills tens of thousands of Turks, and as Semigog explains, forces the Turks to essentially go running and adopt this completely alternative strategy by defeating Vlad through his brother rather than through force of arms.
Yeah, because the Turks obviously tried to cross the Danube to attack Wallachia, but Vlad does actually from the very onset, he makes their campaign difficult, insofar that he, with what forces he has at his disposal, he actually manages to achieve a superiority in sort of skirmisher type troops against the Turks, between sort of archers and light troops. He makes because I think the Turks try to cross at Vidin, which is just sort of northern Bulgaria on the Danube, makes it essentially almost impossible for the Turks to land unmolested, and then once the Turks do succeed in doing so, Vlad just engages in this sort of merciless policy of scorched earth. They create sort of these ad hoc marshes and wetlands by sort of diverting the Danube and its various tributary rivers. They poison wells and water holes. Even like in the forests that sort of scatter the parts of the Danube, Vlad was known to use along sort of pathways where Turkish troops would march. He'd often his forces would often dig literal traps, sort of like kind of like the sort of devices almost the Romans would use at Alesia, sort of back 1500 years prior to these events, and the Turks would be spared absolutely nothing in regards to these tactics. And moreover, even throughout the entirety of their march, the Turks would be just harassed constantly by sort of guerrilla tactics, hit and run tactics between these sort of light troops that the Wallachians were quite expert at, to the extensive use of cavalry. Because if there's one thing to be said for sort of the fighting people of the Pannonian Plain and sort of the Danubian Basin, is they've always been, whether later on in a more sort of heavily armored knight horseback fighting sense, or sort of as light cavalry, sort of more of an acknowledgement of their sort of in some of their population, some of their steppe origin, the Wallachians show quite an immense capability in this regard. And the night attack is actually is quite an interesting scenario where sort of Vlad attempts to go straight for the jugular in this regard. But the Janissaries are, I'm trying to think who commanded the Janissaries. Was it Ali Bey? Semigog, do you know that? If it's Ali Bey who's at in the Wallachian campaign, who's commanding the Janissaries? Either which way,
I don't recall. I'm sorry to say.
No, that's okay. The Wallachians killed, the better part of 1,000 to 2,000 of the Janissaries themselves, but to my knowledge, of course, Mehmed does survive, and it's very much a case of the mouse trying to mount the elephant, because between Vlad himself, the Wallachians are only able to assemble sort of anywhere from 22 to sort of 28, 29, 30,000 troops between light infantry and light cavalry. And the Turks have this sort of massive army, even though they had bled them dry throughout this sort of lower Danubian campaign. But the Turks still number anywhere from sort of, by this stage of the campaign, sort of 100,000-ish maybe. And in the night attack on the June 17th, the Turks suffer anywhere from 10 to 15,000 casualties. But Vlad comes close but doesn't quite pull it off. So Mehmed lives to fight another day.
Absolutely, and there's an interesting. I mean, obviously, I've mentioned how the aftermath of this is rather anticlimactic, and that Vlad is imprisoned by Matthias Corvinus. However, there is a corresponding element to this a decade later, which is the heroic resistance of Stephen the Great, Stephen the Great and the Holy of Moldavia. Moldavia, which had been in a constant series of civil wars and foreign intrigue as a result of Polish and Hungarian and now ultimately Ottoman attempts to take over the country. The Ottomans had taken over Akerman in the south, essentially. And from there, they moved on to attack Stephen's army at Vaslui. And the effect of this was an utter rout of the forces of Mehmed II. However, Mehmed II, after, again, Stephen tried to use scorched earth tactics and avoid getting into another pitched battle with Mehmed, was maneuvered into the Valea Alba and defeated. But nevertheless, despite this defeat, unlike the situation with Vlad the Impaler, Stephen the Great was able to hold on to the northern part of the country. And after the alliance with the Crimean Tatars and the Juray dynasty and the Ottomans, the Tatars were set loose on the Moldavians, but regardless, the northern parts of the country still held out, and they held out also against Bayezid. In fact, as part of this prolonged conflict between Stephen the Great, who was championed as Athleta Christi, champion of Christ by Sixtus IV, he was allied with Dracula, and he was able to put Dracula back on the throne of Wallachia to intensify this grand opposition against Mehmed II. But unfortunately for Stephen the Great, Dracula died within a couple of months of being restored to his throne in Wallachia. So Stephen essentially, fought against Mehmed until Mehmed himself died in 1481. And 20 years after, he was able to consolidate his possession. And it was only through his son, Bogdan, willingly submitting himself to Selim the Grim, that Moldavia was actually finally forced into submission. And again, that was due to Bogdan being more concerned about threats from Crimea, threats from the Polish and the Lithuanians. So you can actually say that Stephen, in some respects, actually represents a successful attempt at delaying the Ottoman advance. And, had Dracula lived, we could have again seen perhaps the political unification of Romania, and then pushing into pushing into Bulgaria, and possibly undoing a part of that conquest. But of course, this isn't just a Wallachian affair. We can go to the south, and of course, we have this ongoing naval war throughout the 1460s and 70s between the Venetians and the Turks. And as part of this, the Venetians, in addition to holding possessions in Crete, in Corfu, they also hold possessions in Albania and, of course, across the Dalmatia. And if you look at this map, you can see that the Ottomans are now pressing towards Venetian territories on all fronts, essentially. And, of course, they're now fighting for the maritime domination of the Eastern Mediterranean itself. Skanderbeg, in theory, represents really nothing more than just, an extension of this Venetian and indeed Neapolitan power. Nevertheless, Skanderbeg, despite only controlling about 40% of Albania, part of Albania had already been conquered by the Ottomans. The other parts were the Venetian held. His so-called League of Leger. He was able to hold out and retain this region in central Albania for. Again, it's a similar situation to Vlad the Impaler, where his father had been a vassal of the Ottomans, and he had served with the Ottomans for 20 years. He served with them until just before the Battle of Varna, which he successfully switched sides. And from 1443 onwards until his death in 1468, he was able to defeat Ottoman hordes which are vastly outnumbered him every single time. Nevertheless, he was only able to defeat them so long as he was alive. And after he died, essentially the Venetians capitulated more or less in 1479 and ceded many vital strongholds across the Albanian coastline to the Ottomans. The Ottomans weren't able to gain the entirety of Albania. They held on to, the Venetians held on to Durrës for a little bit longer, but nevertheless, Skanderbeg, using the minor resources of Albania, was able to again offer a 25-year continuous resistance against the Ottomans, and Mehmed was only able to essentially defeat him and overcome him by Skanderbeg dying, essentially, in terms of
dying of malaria or something of that sort. And he held them at bay for 20 years with his Albanians and or Slavs and Vlachs and very often without any real assistance from Venice, who just left him to his own devices. And only at the very end did they even care to help him. And with, as few as 10,000 men against huge armies, he consistently did very well. And I think, as you mentioned, having the same background as he did with Vlad, having been a hostage, I think that probably contributed to his effectiveness. Doubtless, he was individually a very rare person, but having knowledge from the inside of how they operated, how they were organized, how their troops worked, and the rest, I think that went a long way towards helping him. But he's someone who's generally not as remembered as much in the West as figures that got their names, through nailing people's hats to their heads or pushing people into barns and closing the doors and burning them all alive, like Vlad did. Skanderbeg was quite a character.
Skanderbeg and Vlad almost it's a Ottoman equivalent, essentially, of Arminius problem, of Arminius having been sort of trained by the Roman army, educated in Latin, understood all the Roman mores and, in a military context, their strategies and their tactics, their marching orders, etc. He came to understand the Romans all too well, and sort of when Arminius sprung his trap at Tetutoburgerwald, it was by knowledge of how the Romans did things, and to some degree, you could almost say the same thing is true of both Vlad the Impaler and of Skanderbeg, with their campaigns against quite monumental odds against the Ottomans. And for anyone who's actually traveled to that part of the world, I've actually not been to Albania myself, traveled around there though, and if you look at the landscape of what you'd probably call classical Epirus, with the exception of the flat lands that sort of sit alongside the coastal cities of what the Romans would call Dyrrachium or Durrës, of Lore, of Tirana, the sort of modern cities of Albania. You go into the mountains and it's perfect ambush country. Like the ability to be able to sort of set choke points and lay ambushes and traps, and then the capturing of strong fortresses. All those things can be used as force multipliers against a much stronger enemy.
Yes, absolutely. But of course, albeit he's not successful, and the Venetians do finally capitulate, which leads to, the other important thing to mention, of course, is whilst this is happening, we have I mentioned already, the fall of the Principality of Theodora in the Peritea. Well, the Peritea, which had more or less come under the influence of the Genoese, had now been acquired by Mehmed II. And in addition to that, you have a convenient succession war after the death of the founder of the Crimean Khanate. And Mehmed intervenes decisively in that conflict, and as a result of that, gains the Crimean Khanate essentially as a vassal for the next 300 years. The Khan of Crimea would occupy a position of prominence in the Ottoman court, only second to that of the Sultan himself. And again, they would periodically, on the sort of due to the whims of the Sultan, penetrate deep into Russian territory and raid all across the Ukraine, which is also where Roxolana, later Hurum Sultan, the famous wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, of course, came from, was through
the single woman who did more damage to the Ottoman Empire than any other person. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a bit of tragic irony for you there. So this comes in through this Crimean connection, which was forged by Mehmed II. But Mehmed II's final ambition was to realize his universal claim to be the Caesar of the Romans. And this was through acquiring the city of Rome itself. So having defeated the Genoese and having defeated the Venetians in their peripheral territories and their overseas territories, now having gained control of the Straits of Otranto, Mehmed can now launch an attack on the Italian peninsula himself. And as we went into briefly on our stream on the Italian wars, this of course featured, very prominently in terms of the reign of Ferdinand I. But albeit Mehmed arrived, he was able to take the city, and then he died very soon afterwards. The effect of this essentially was that Otranto, after several months, was retaken by the Neapolitan forces. Nevertheless, and the Venetian forces. Nevertheless, this goal to expand and conquer Italy, which was the last major campaign of Mehmed II, was put on hold indefinitely. And this could be seen as an anomaly within the grander scheme of Ottoman expansion, this direct attempt to try and acquire the city of Rome and therefore establish his ultimate legitimacy as the successor of the Roman Empire by conquest. And Bayezid, you can say, represents a complete departure. I mean, in terms of the conflicts, the most intense conflict he has, of course, is by nature the Ottoman succession system is through fratricide, by defeating his brother Cem, who moves off and becomes part of French and later papal and Neapolitan contrivance about a crusade which never materialized. But Bayezid is far more modest in his ambitions, again, not focused in this series of, in addition to just the Balkan conquest, it should be noted, Mehmed II finally unites the Anatolian Beyliks after the devastating defeat of Ankara, finally avenging that defeat. And it'll be his grandson, Selim I, who will finally take over the Ramazanids and the Dulkadir and defeat the Safavid Shah Ismail at Chowdhuram and take over Eastern Anatolia, but that'll be a subject for our next stream. So he established again an empire, an effective empire, and using this position wanted to expand further and attack Italy. But of course, under Bayezid, you essentially have a 30-year or so truce, so much so that this actually culminates in his eventual demise in 1512. One of the few wars he was actually involved in was the Second Venetian War. Or was it the third? I can't quite remember. Anyway, in which Bayezid finally unites the Morea under the Ottomans, takes certain islands in the west, such as Cephalonia and Ithaca. And here I've sort of labeled this the culmination of this war as the original conquest of the Balkans, who have peripheral territory. So for example, Belgrade will hold on until the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, and the island of Rhodes, the island of Crete, the island of Cyprus will all be taken later. But in terms of the first phase of conquest, before we have the massive expansion under the reign of Selim and Suleiman, this is basically the end of that initial stage of conquest.
And interestingly enough, the island of Corfu is never captured by the Turks.
Yes, it remains a Venetian possession, and then it finally becomes a Russo-French possession, and ultimately a British possession, which will be reunited with Greece in the 1860s. So indeed. Yes, Corfu, one of the only elements of Greece which never falls to the Ottomans.
Correct. Just one thing, just on that, because you mentioned Otranto. There's sort of a profound difference with, say, when the Ottomans crossed the Bosphorus and took the castle there at Sestos, or just next to Sestos on the Dardanelles, and sort of broke out into the Balkans and overran Bulgaria in I think this period of like 2 or 3 years, and then subjugated the Serbian kingdom and basically made the better part of Western Greece its possession prior to taking the city of Constantinople. There's an idea that they're sort of eating away at sort of this dying Roman Empire and its this incapability of East Rome to have defended itself. And you sort of saw that with the East Romans unable to hold on to those Anatolian cities such as Nicaea or Nicaea and Nicomedia, Bursa, etc. With those sort of campaigns under the Andronicus II and III. Whereas landing at Otranto, the Turks are contesting with an Italian sort of landmass and people who sort of have a bit more going for them than say what the Greeks did. You know, even though the Italians themselves are sort of dominated by foreigners to some degree, Italy at this point is a relatively wealthy place, and the parts of Italy that aren't self-sovereign and aren't self-governing find themselves part of either the Angevin Empire or part of the Aragonese Kingdom, or of the Kingdom of Spain under the Habsburgs. The Berbers rather. These lands are able to defend themselves. They're not so wide open to Turkish attack, and them being able to sort of temporarily capture Otranto really doesn't amount to anything, because the Turks are not able to strengthen this bridgehead and sort of use it for a future expansion. Whereas in the case of sort of East Rome, you kind of have a feeling the dominoes were falling over the moment the Turks crossed into Europe.
Yes, exactly. I think have I forgotten my point? Yes, sorry, I have completely forgotten my point. Sorry, but yes, thank you, Marcus. I think also what this constant flow of Ottoman conquest does, of course, it leads to a major reaction, a cultural reaction in Europe, which was exhibited through, for example, the Feast of the Pheasant, the court of Philip the Good of Burgundy, and later that of such figures such as Maximilian. But the idea of a successful crusade never really materializes. Yet at the same time, you have this sense of impending doom. And I think at Otranto, that sense of impending doom was always excruciating, of course. And what the reign of Bayezid, with the exception of Venice, is it basically allows Europe to catch its breath for a while, and the Ottomans, of course, to consolidate after continuous expansion and having to raise army after army after army to deal with these constant defeats and ultimately victories. But of course, this feeling of impending doom and the Ottomans striking, the sword of Osman into the heart of Europe is going to come back with a vengeance when we talk about the fall of Belgrade and the Battle of Mohacs and the situation in Hungary after 1526. But again, that'll be a lead-in to another stream. So unless either of you two wonderful gentlemen want to say anything in summary, we can go on to the Super Chats.
None, no comment from me.
All I'll sort of say, because the last half an hour I've had to sort of jump on and off just intermittently, so I apologize to the audience and my co-host for my rudeness. That Skanderbeg, even though I actually haven't had a chance to sort of study him in the same way that, I've studied people such as, Julius Caesar or Nicephorus Phocas or, Belisarius, for example, and for those who've listened to our streams, you have listened to me delve into some detail on their campaigns, and I know even less about Vlad for that matter. But the one impression I did get from Skanderbeg's campaigns was he's within a relatively close and tight geographical proximity. His campaigns are fought with a dramatic sense of energy. He's almost a master of medieval movement warfare through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe to fight in, and his successes and his method of fighting really exemplify the advantage of fighting on a home territory that a commander and his troops understand intimately so, and also a commander who has equal or at least comparable understanding of his own forces' strengths and weaknesses and those of his enemies, and the ability in some way, kind of like Leonidas at Thermopylae to a degree, and for example, Caesar used this from time to time as well in his Gallic campaigns, being able to use an opponent's numbers against them. There are a lot of commanders in history who don't necessarily use that to their advantage, and there are very few commanders who do. And Skanderbeg happens to be one of them. It's no sort of wonder why. I mean, I know it's a bit of a meme, but it's no wonder people call him Scandabro, because his method of fighting is quite Chad-like, and he's just relentless. And with such meager resources, Skanderbeg is able to really humble the Ottoman forces. And had they happened perhaps a little earlier in time, perhaps Varna, perhaps Nicopolis could have panned out differently. But it just so happens that Skanderbeg is just this one example of a standout force against, you know, immense opposition, and still carves a name for himself in history. I think Skanderbeg is someone who, you know, can hold his head up high in history and probably deserves a lot more prominence than he gets presently.
And just one quick thing for people who don't know, Iskandar Bey or Iskandar Beg simply means Lord Alexander.
Exactly, because his surname is actually a derivative of Kastrioti, which is his middle name, essentially.
Just one point, really embellishing on Semigog's point he made earlier in the stream. What is interesting is that despite you have these very, you know, ferocious and effective leaders in the form of Dracula, in the form of Stephen the Great, in the form of Skanderbeg, all of these rulers essentially conducted their campaigns on their own, almost in opposition to the European powers around them, the greater powers, be they Venice or be they Hungary. I mean, an interesting point about Matthias Corvinus is that whilst he established the effective Black Army in Hungary, one of Europe's first professional armies, which was later disbanded after his death, rather than utilizing that army and augmenting the forces of the Wallachians, the Moldovians, and the Albanians, he instead decided to attack Bohemia and ultimately to attack Austria, his political enemies. And of course, you know, Matthias Corvinus believed he was justified in attacking Bohemia and attacking Georgia Podiebrad and later Władysław Jagiellon, because they were in league with the Hussites, who, of course, heretics, the Catholics. Nevertheless, I think, had those resources and that effective leadership, Matthias Corvinus was one of the most effective kings of Hungary, possibly ever. It would be interesting to see how history would have played out differently if those rulers had had genuine support from the West. And again, if we looked at figures like Philip the Good of Burgundy and look at his 1454 Feast of the Pheasant and wondered whether that would have actually materialized into a genuine attempt by the Western powers to utilize these effective figures on the ground to push back towards, you know, a reconquest of Constantinople. I think there's also another point to make, which is why I've been quite scathing on Georgius Scholaris and the isolation, you can say the internalization of the Greek Orthodox Church, is that the Greek Orthodox Church, through its submission to Mehmed and through its, you could say, acquiescence to the Devashirme. I mean, I'm talking in terms of people like George Scholaris. There was, of course, major local resistance to the Devashirme. In some places, you could essentially, it was used as an incentive to convert to Islam. Convert to Islam and your boys would not be taken as slaves. In other cases, there were revolts against the Devashirme system. But nevertheless, because the Orthodox hierarchy in Greece, their hatred of the Western Christendom or Catholicism was such that they were prepared to actively facilitate the continued Turkish invasion into Europe, rather than fight them. I do find that rather remarkable, and the point that needs to be made regardless as to why I'm still quite scathing of Georgius Kaladios, because whilst you can make the claim that he was, again, in his rights to, assert his theological opposition to Rome, and of course he was following in the tradition of 800 years of ecumenical patriarchs, nevertheless, what was it in service for? Which was, the further undermining of the boundaries of Christendom. So yes, I'll get onto the super chats now after making that a rather bleak point.
Just very quickly, if I could add that, this whole period underscores problems that people in the Balkan countries suffer from today, which is they're considered this sort of afterthought, this sort of backwater by the rest of the European powers, when in fact they play a very, very important role. I mean, even today, dealing with the mass migration of peoples as a borderlands, and again and again and again, they're left to their own devices by, in their day, the various imperial powers, or today in Brussels, another form of imperial power, it could be argued, and it was such an issue that no less a figure than, as you both well know, Machiavelli came in later and actually applied his thinking to the problem of the unity versus the constant contention of nobles in the West. And so in The Prince, he used the example of the Turkish sultanate, to contrast the issues with the nobles in the West, where he talked about, how easy it was to seize control of a region in the West, and how incredibly difficult it was to hold it because of the nobles, whereas in the East, because of the sort of autocratic power of the sultan, which is, wasn't entire, of course. There are many fault lines, but by contrast, it was incredibly difficult to take power. But if you could seize it, you could keep it because of the nature of the arrangements. And then the last point to throw in is that you have to remember that when these people fighting at terrible odds in most cases, certainly in this later period that we're talking about, where Skanderbeg Bey has to fight by himself, Vlad Tepes has to fight in large part on his own without much help from other parties. They were facing the Ottomans at the very beginning of their peak, their absolute peak. They had the armor that was comparable in most ways to that in the West. They didn't have full plate. They had better archers for the most part. They had better horsemen. Certainly there could be cases where you're out on the Pannonian Plain and you have Hungarian cavalry that could, rival them. But for the most part, they were superior with their cavalry. And they were much better organized overall. You wouldn't have a situation like you did at one of these early battles. It wasn't Varna, but a bit before that, I believe, and I think you guys mentioned the battle, there were cases where the nobility would just ignore the orders of their superiors.
And
just
Nicopolis, yeah.
Right. So all this by way of underscoring that the people who fought successfully against them, they were fighting against one of the highest performance military machines in the world at that point, since the disappearance of the Mongols and Tamerlane, certainly. And they were doing so without help, as they often do today. So all of these figures that we tend to look at as, historical curiosities, like Dracula, I want to suck your blood, and as Skanderbeg Bey and Hunyadi, who the Turks mocked by calling him Yanko, which is kind of like Yaniko. It's like a diminutive. It's like Little John or whatever. These guys, they are notable and should be remembered for what they attempted to do.
Absolutely, and thank you for that, Semigog. Onto the super chats. Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker for $5. Thank you very much. Better a turban than a tiara. Fox often forgets the Greeks viewed themselves as already occupied by a Catholic lord they wanted removed. Well, yes, I think that's true in part. I think we've tried to examine that quite a lot regarding the Francocratia. And regarding Constantine XI, it was definitely the view of George Scalalius that, again, a union with Rome would be the equivalent of basically submitting to the Pope. Nevertheless, I think what Constantine XI essentially did, I mean, I essentially, again, I almost believe that he couldn't have done anything any differently, really. He inherited an incredibly fraught position. He inherited an empire and a state of religious schism that was dependent on its theological enemies, which had wreaked so much havoc on it during the sack of Rome. And he was also, his lands were surrounded. He had been very effective as the despot of Morea. And something which we didn't mention is that during the attack on Varna, he had actually led his own campaign into Thessaly and briefly taken it, only to be defeated when the Ottomans, after Varna, with vastly superior numbers, drove him back and undermined many of his, virtually all of his gains, and pushed him back into Athens. But I think, yes, I think we've gone into that quite a lot. Phantom Spaceman for $5. Thank you very much. Is it possible that the siege would have never been successful if Constantine the 11th could meet all hands price? I think that was just a pretext. Ultimately, I believe that Mehmed II was intending to attack the city regardless, as he did with Trebizond, and that simply provided a useful pretext to breaking Murad II's treaty with Constantine the 11th. Marcus?
Sorry, go on, Apostle.
No, that's basically all I wanted to say.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think sometimes with events like this in history, we sort of tend to assume too readily its conclusion. I have to say if you look at the maps of the two empires of the time and the region of the time, no doubt that the Ottomans were coveting Constantinople and saw its existence as being a thorn in their side. I mean, and frankly, we sort of canvass this a little bit in our past streams. We'll talk about sort of like the Byzantine Arab Wars. I mean, the forces of Islam always sort of coveted Constantinople as a city almost from inception. So there's a long narrative in so far as that's concerned. But in respect to the actual siege specifically of 1453, even though there's a vast disparity between the two forces, I don't think it was actually that much of a foregone conclusion. I still think it was a very difficult siege for the Byzantines to have prevailed in. But certainly there were aspects of it that they had advantages in, certain deficiencies which the Ottomans had. And with the force multiplier of the Theodosian walls, despite being kind of outdated, they were still a monumental obstruction to the Turks. And I mean, had the Beyliks risen up in Anatolia, had there been intervention by any of the Western European countries, who knows? The outcome could have been different. In respect to Orban specifically, I think it isn't so much that can the Byzantines prevail with his cannons, but if he enters the service of the empire, more importantly, the Turks don't get the big cannons that end up fracturing and causing the first breaches in the Theodosian walls. So it's a case of what does Mehmed not having Urban services, how does that affect the Turks' ability to break apart the Roman defenses? But let's assume that Constantinos had prevailed in the siege. The Turks would have circled back 20 years later, 50 years later, and finished the job. I mean, there's just no doubt that the empire, one way or another, was on its last legs. It was definitely once the Turks cross into Europe, it's a case almost not if but when, especially once the Bulgarians and the Serbs fall, the Romans lose close potential allies, and everything has to come from further and further beyond. And that's really what sort of tips the odds in favor of the Turks long term.
I think there's one thing that sets Mehmed II apart from his predecessors. Bayezid, of course, had attacked Constantinople in 1402, and Murad II had attacked Constantinople at the beginning of his reign. The difference is that both attempts were rather faint. There wasn't a serious attempt to attack the city. But right from 1451, from the reascension of Mehmed II, there is a deliberate attempt to mobilize the entire resources of the Ottoman Empire towards the conquest of the city, with the theological motivation behind it. I think Mehmed II had the motivation to take the city, which was lacking in his two predecessors. I think that is, again, something to consider. And again, I think the monster bombards, were they definitive? Did they play that much of a successful part of the battle? I relay back to the fact that the Crusaders in 1204 were still able to take the city without that decisive advantage. So it is possible. And
also, I would go so far to say as well that there's an old saying by Eisenhower that I find that plans in warfare are useless, but planning is indispensable, and that what Mehmed did well was planning the siege for Constantinople, whereas some of the other events were maybe not half-hearted, but they certainly didn't have the thorough preparation that Mehmed had for attacking Constantinople.
Yes.
Building the fortress on the Dardanelles with the guns, digging the earthworks. He did a lot of preparatory stuff.
There are some, seemingly also superhuman feats which later become, a fundamental part of like Turkish iconography, such as the moving the ships over into the Golden Horn. Which again is, in terms of like a logistical maneuver, it's quite brilliant. I mean, it even, I believe, forms the beginning of the Fethi Monsieur, which of course later during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Turkish armies are going to be accompanied by the Meytaran, the war bands essentially, and the beginning of the Fethi Monsieur. In English goes, sail shall be cut off, sail shall be sewed, galleons pulled from a mountain shall be pushed, essentially. So again, it's this iconography of the battle which is wedded to it. It's not just a pushover. There is a gargantuan effort made by one of the greatest empires in the world to achieve this feat, which is taking over one of the most strategically, defensible cities by design, the city of Constantine, essentially. And
exactly, and just very quickly too, you're talking about iconography as well. We mentioned about the waxing of the moon and how that plays into some sort of prophecy regarding the city. I can't actually find it. I've just tried to scan the Wikipedia article. I can't find it. It's somewhere. But there was also something to do about ships moving over land, which the Greeks thought preposterous. But then when these ships were being rolled over with oiled logs across around Galata and overland, was sort of another stab at the morale of the Greeks when this prophecy, which seemed so incredibly outlandish, had turned true. It's just that being another aspect of it.
Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker again for $5. Thank you very much. Often overlooked, Constantinople was already paying Murad taxes back in the 1380s. The Sultanate of Rumelia essentially granted them pseudo-sovereignty. Well, it wasn't necessarily a grant of pseudo-sovereignty, Jedi Knight. It was rather paying tribute to avoid being raided and attacked, essentially. I view it as very similar to a situation adopted by many Mongol rulers and their tributary status. So long as you kept paying, like Moscow is a similar example, so long as you kept paying the tribute to the successors of Batu Khan in Sari, then you're not going to have Moscow looted. Of course, with Constantinople, that was an entirely different predicament because Moscow and many of the cities in Russia were very easily conquered by the Mongols, whereas, as we see, it's incredibly difficult to take Constantinople, and it took a huge effort regardless to take on Constantinople anyway. So I don't think it was a grant by the Ottomans of pseudo-sovereignty. I think it was a recognition on behalf of the late Paleologos of their incredibly tenuous position. But as we see, it was no simple matter of taking the city, and so a grant of sovereignty, I think, is a bit too much.
I agree with that.
Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker for $5. Thus, as Constantinople was a vassal of Sultan Mehmed II, was simply replacing a Catholic Stuart who thought himself an emperor. Needless to say, I think we all disagree with that.
Disavow.
Fiercely I disavow that. The idea that Constantine XI was just a papal puppet, I think we've thoroughly debunked that idea. John Gordon for $5 RIP Byzantine Empire 330-1453. You may not be Romans to AA, but you are to me. No, that's very sweet, John Gordon. Well, I mean, my own position, which I've reiterated many times, is that the Roman Empire fell in 1204, and what we're seeing here is a rump. I mean, even in terms of the administration, we're seeing it adopt many European practices. I mean, the only thing that probably, holding on to the city and holding on to the religion is a key part of, suzerainty and legitimacy for the city. But as we see, even towards the end, that becomes contentious.
Yeah. Which is the opinion too of Edward Luttwak and amongst others, and I kind of agree. Certainly from a continuation standpoint, 1204 really is the end of East Rome as an empire, and what's left is sort of an ethnocentric Greek kingdom remnant.
Bolero 393 for $10. Thank you very much. Laura Brownworth's account of Constantine XI's life and last stand is in Lost to the West. It's heartbreaking but quite awe-inspiring. If only we were ruled by a man of such character and fortitude. Interesting art. Check that out. Yes, and I do agree that he is iconic for a reason, especially in contrast to his brothers. Machiavelliscus to go for $5. Thank you very much. Oh my God, how do you guys know so much? We don't know that much. Reading, I don't know. Semigog, how do you know so much?
I forget most of what I know, but when I do have it together, it's usually because I've reviewed notes and that sort of thing. Yeah, but everybody has a different way to hang the meat on a skeleton. Some do it with dates, which become a structure in their mind that they begin to hang things around. And then once they have a date fixed in memory because of one thing, they add images to it and they have a better skeleton. Some do it with maps. Everybody has their own sort of way of trying to build the scaffolding for the knowledge, but it's generally just reading and talking to people. More importantly, I learn more in conversations from people who know about things more easily in many respects than I do from cracking open the book. So, yeah, good library and good peers.
Super Master Juice for $2. Ottomans and Triple N is a difficult combination now, incredibly thick here. What does Triple N stand for?
Don't know.
Yeah, I'm at a loss.
John Boy for €10. Thanks again, AM, and also Semigog and Pertinassos. Particularly loved the Hecate references. Well, that's all Semigog and linking this back to the ancient origins and the founding mythology of the city. So thank you very much to Semigog for that. So do we have any other super chats come in? Just quickly check. My internet is still very slow. Yes, we do. Marcus for 588 for $8 Australian. Thank you very much. Constantinos 100% confirmed Chad. Must have nearly killed poor Furious to read his speech and the story of his brave last stand with the Romans. Well, how are you, Furious? Are you still alive? Are you still with us?
Just, yes, I've in a way the story has great heroism, so I've been wanting to tell it. But I think for anyone who is a Romanophile or a Hellenophile, the 1453 does bring about a tremendous sadness and sense of lamentation, all of us. And I think from also a Western historiographic perspective, no matter what your persuasion is towards how you might feel about the Byzantines or East Romans, call them what you wish, there is a massively admirable courage that comes with Constantine and his last stand and his simple refusal to either give the city over or to himself surrender. And then you see this bastion of Constantinople, which by the time of the fall in 1453, it is the second last city of the Pentarchy. I mean, the one that is remaining after that is Rome itself, and Constantinople. Certainly prior to 1204 and to some degree prior to 1453 is this sort of beacon of Roman civilization, of sort of Greco-Roman civilization that has a continual lineage, right back to Constantine the Great. And if you consider the Hellenic aspect, far prior to that, in terms of you're talking almost the classical Hellenic age of the of the Greek period of the days of Plato and Socrates, and for that to be lost to European civilization, I think would make anyone sort of our ilk sad. So yes,
there's one point about I would say the dramatic sort of narrative thread in history relating this back to Constantine the 11th, because I think he is a fascinating figure in this regard. The Roman Empire in the West fell in a rather pathetic function. The city of Rome had already become virtually politically and economically not irrelevant, but less relevant.
I'd say inert. Yeah.
Inert compared to the cities of Mediolanum, later Milan, and of course Ravenna. And the final fall of the city was, the empire was not related even to Rome itself or Ravenna. And the fall, of course, corresponded with Romulus Augustulus, the son of Orestes, being pensioned off by Odovacar. However, when you look at the pathetic military record of especially the majority of the Palaiologos dynasty, after the Lascaris usurpation by Michael, and you have about 50 years where the Byzantine Empire under the Palaiologos is able to hold on to roughly about half of Greece and the city of Constantinople, but it's never able to undo the Francocratia. It's never able to unite all the rump states under its control. And of course, after the 1350s, the main power fighting off the Christians becomes the Serbian Empire and later the Hungarians. In many senses, the Byzantine Empire actually plays a bit part in terms of the overall Ottoman conquest of Europe from 1350 onwards, after Orhan and Murad cross over the Straits of Gallipoli. But I find in Constantine the 11th an incredibly rare figure in terms of the broad scope of this dynasty, someone who is able to embody this, Gibbon-esque sense of genuine Romanitas, like a Stilicho figure or like a Belisarius. And he's able to, despite the weakened position of the empire, where it could have very easily gone out with a whimper, he's able to immortalize basically the defense of the city, and able, through the prophecy of the Marble Emperor, to almost achieve a sense of godhood, which I think more so than my rather pedantic assumption that Rome fell in 1204, you could almost say that the spirit of Rome is resurrected in the form of Constantine XI, and the Paleologos dynasty is vindicated in him in that small amount of time before the city is finally conquered.
It's a last roar, essentially. You
Yes.
know, the lion get off one last before he's slain. And about the Marble Emperor too, because you just mentioned it, and I saw Ioannis Palaiologos in the chat saying the same thing. There's a few, there's the Emperor Under the Mountain. I did mention that a little bit earlier, but which is similar to the Frederick Barbarossa prophecy, whether he was sort of embedded into the Theodosian walls and will awaken one day to reclaim the city. And then there's another prophecy saying that he was taken away by angels at the just prior to the moment of his death. So, yeah, we'll I guess in due course we'll find out what the truth is.
Anyway, Marcus, Semiagog, anything either of you want to shill before we go?
I'm good. I suppose for us it's just a case of us continuing next week, whatever our stream is. I believe is it the Russian Caesar next week?
No, I was going to do Suleiman the Magnificent on this stream,
okay,
but
so
we've done 3 hours, I think
okay.
It was a wise decision to leave Suleiman for next stream, and then we'll do the Russians.
I agree. As for myself, I don't think I've got anything on. I might be popping on for a cigar stream, I think, in the next week or two. But that aside, I've got a pretty open calendar, so I'll pass it on to Semi if he's got anything lined up.
At the moment, I think I just have, if I can make it, if my schedule does not become crazy as it threatens to do, given my personal affairs, I will likely be joining you gentlemen for the Kanuni Suleiman the Magnificent stream. That's going to be at the same start time for you guys next week on the 8th, I believe, if I got that right. And I think I just put something together with American Krogan to talk about subversion in video games, and that will likely be coming up on Wednesday the 10th, but we're still putting that together. So that's all I have for now. I just want to say it's a great pleasure always to be here, my favorite history channel, and I enjoy listening to you gents all the time, so it was nice to be here once again to participate for once. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Indeed. It's good to have you, mate.
You recently did a stream, I think yesterday, on the Masonic influence through the French Revolution. In particular, talking about one of my favorite figures in history, Philippe Egalité. I was very happy with that perspective that was offered in the stream. So please, everyone, do check out Semiagog's channel and check out that stream in particular. It was wonderful to watch. Other than that, and other than thanking Semiagog and Marcus for being on such wonderful form this evening, just to say, if you enjoyed the stream, please do leave a like and possibly a comment. If you're interested in doing something a bit more for the channel, there is the possibility of clicking on the link in the description and going over and becoming a patron on Subscribestar. To all those who have become patrons, thank you very much. Thank you to my wonderful guests. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and good night.
Good night, everyone. Take care.